Chapter 1. The rain had been falling since noon, and by the time the sun dropped behind the Hokage monument, the streets of Konoha had emptied into a gray, glistening silence. Naruto Uzumaki sat beneath the eave of a closed noodle stand, knees pulled to his chest, watching water run in threads down the paper lanterns above him. He was 7 years old, and he had learned, in the careful way that lonely children learn things, that rain was easier to bear than the stares that came with clear skies. No one had chased him tonight. No one had thrown anything, or hissed a word he was not supposed to understand but understood anyway. Tonight there had simply been nothing. An empty apartment, a cold meal he had made himself, and the small, familiar ache of being a person no one thought to look for. Sometimes the emptiness was worse than the cruelty. Cruelty at least meant someone had noticed he existed. He got up when his legs went stiff and began to walk, not toward home, but away from it, following the old drainage canal that ran along the eastern wall until the shops thinned into warehouses and the warehouses gave way to trees. He was not supposed to be out this late. He was not supposed to be near the tree line at all, not with the forest so close to the parts of the village people whispered about. But the forest had never once looked at him like he was something to be swept off a step, and that counted for a great deal. The canopy broke the worst of the rain into a softer patter, and the deeper he went, the more the night seemed to change around him. The air smelled of wet cedar and cold stone. Somewhere off to his left an owl called, low and steady, and did not stop when he passed beneath its branch, the way birds usually stopped when they noticed him. He told himself he was only walking. He did not let himself notice that he was choosing his footing with unusual care, stepping over roots he should not have been able to see in the dark, until he found himself in a clearing he had never known was there. At its center stood a slab of pale stone, half swallowed by ivy, carved with a shape he almost recognized, a crescent moon cradling a drawn bow, worn nearly smooth by weather and time. Antlers, real ones, old and bleached white, had been set into the earth around its base like a fence no one had built on purpose. The rain did not seem to touch the clearing the way it touched the trees around it. It fell instead like something being poured slowly through silver thread, and where it struck the stone, it did not splash but simply vanished, as though the moon itself was drinking. Naruto stood very still, feeling something he did not have the words for yet. Not fear, exactly. He knew fear. Fear was familiar, uncomfortable, and mundane. This was quieter and larger, like standing at the edge of something so old it had forgotten to be surprised by him. "Hello?" he said to no one, because there was no one to say it to, and because 7-year-olds who have spent their whole lives being ignored develop a habit of speaking into silence just to hear a voice, even their own. Nothing answered. He almost laughed at himself. Almost turned around and walked home, wet and cold and foolish, the way he always did after chasing some half-formed hope that turned out to be nothing. But his feet carried him closer instead, until he stood directly before the stone, tracing the crescent moon with 2 fingers, feeling the grooves worn deep by centuries of rain. "I don't have anybody," he said quietly, and the words surprised him coming out, because he had never once said them aloud, not even to himself in the dark of his own apartment. "I don't have a mom or a dad. Nobody in the village even looks at me unless they're yelling. I just wanted somebody to see me. That's all. I don't need anybody to like me. I just want somebody to actually see me." The wind, if it was wind, moved through the clearing then, stirring the antlers so they clicked together like wind chimes made of bone, and for one long moment every drop of rain in the clearing hung motionless in the air, catching what little moonlight bled through the storm clouds, so that the whole space seemed filled with 1,000 tiny, frozen stars. Naruto's breath caught. He did not move. He was afraid that if he so much as blinked, whatever this was would end, and he would go back to being a boy no one looked at in a village that had already decided what he was before he ever had the chance to be anything. A sound rose behind him, low and clear, not quite a howl and not quite a horn, carrying no menace in it at all, only a kind of ancient, patient welcome. He turned toward it, and saw, at the tree line where a moment before there had been only darkness, a pair of eyes, silver and calm, watching him without judgment for the first time in his short and difficult life. The rain resumed. The stars of water fell and struck the earth. And somewhere far above the clouds, though Naruto could not have known it yet, a goddess who had not taken a chosen champion of the hunt in longer than this small, ragged village had existed, turned her attention downward and, for the first time in a very long while, felt something close to interest. Chapter 2. The eyes did not blink, and they did not retreat. Naruto found himself walking toward them before he had decided to, the way people sometimes walk toward the one warm light in an unfamiliar street, without weighing the wisdom of it at all. The rain had gone soft and silver, and the deeper he stepped into that strange hush, the less it seemed to matter that this was almost certainly a very bad idea. The eyes belonged to a doe, tall and pale as birch bark, standing utterly unafraid at the edge of the clearing. She did not startle when he drew close enough to touch her, only turned her head and looked at him the way the owl had looked at him earlier, as though he were an ordinary and welcome part of the forest rather than an interruption in it. Then, without sound, without any warning at all, the doe was not a doe. She was a woman, tall as the oldest trees, dressed in something the color of moonlight on water, a silver bow resting easily across one shoulder, as though it had grown there. Naruto stumbled back a step. Not from fear, though there was some of that too, but from the simple overwhelming fact of her, the way a person feels standing at the edge of a cliff they did not know was there until their foot found empty air. "You called," she said, and her voice was low and clear, like the horn sound from before, though you did not know that was what you were doing. Naruto's mouth was dry. He had imagined, in the vague way children imagine things, that if he ever met someone important, he would know exactly what to say. He did not know what to say. "Who are you?" "I have been called many things, in many places, by many small, brave, overlooked children." She crouched, so that her eyes were level with his, and something in her face, sharp and ancient and utterly without pity, softened at the sight of him soaked through and shivering and refusing, even now, to run. "You may call me Artemis, if names matter to you. They rarely matter to me as much as what stands behind them." The name meant nothing to him, and he said so, plainly, because he had never learned the trick of pretending to know things he did not. Something like amusement crossed her face. "No," she agreed. "Your village does not remember the old names. That is no fault of yours." She tilted her head, studying him the way a hunter studies weather, reading things in him that he did not yet know were there to be read. "You walked into my grove alone, at night, in a storm, because a village of thousands could not be bothered to walk beside you even once. You did not come here for power. You did not come here to be saved. You came here because you were tired of not being seen, and you were brave enough to go looking for someone who might." Naruto's throat tightened in a way that had nothing to do with the cold. "That's stupid," he mumbled, because admitting she was right felt like standing somewhere even more exposed than he already was. "It is not stupid," Artemis said, and there was an edge in her voice now, not aimed at him but at everything that had made him feel that it was. "I have walked the wild places of 100 worlds and watched 100 village gates close on children exactly like you. Most given to the loneliness. Some given to the cruelty done to them and become cruel in turn. A very few," and here she reached out, and touched 2 fingers to his forehead, light as falling snow, "keep some untouched, stubborn kindness alive in themselves anyway, and go on protecting things smaller than they are, even when no one protects them. That is rarer than any bloodline. It is the only quality I have ever required of the ones I choose." A warmth spread from where she had touched him, not painful, more like sinking into a hot spring after a long cold walk, and somewhere deep inside him, in the place where a great and ancient weight had slept curled around his navel since before he could remember, something stirred and went very still, listening. "Choose me for what?" Naruto whispered. "To hunt," Artemis said simply, "not men, and not for sport, but the things that prey on the small and the overlooked. To move unseen through dark places and come out again with the innocent safe behind you. To be, when your village has forgotten how, a guardian of the wild and the wounded." She stood, and the moonlight seemed to gather more thickly around her shoulders, as though the clouds themselves were paying attention now. "It will not be easy. It will not make the ones who ignored you suddenly love you. But you will never again stand in a clearing and wonder if anyone sees you. I see you, Naruto Uzumaki. From this night I always will." The rain fell harder around the edges of the clearing, and lighter within it, until at its very center it stopped falling altogether, and Naruto stood dry beneath a goddess's regard for the first time in his life, too stunned to be afraid, too hopeful to look away. Chapter 3. Naruto woke on the floor of his own apartment, tangled in a blanket he did not remember pulling over himself, with morning light slanting gray and ordinary through a window he had never bothered to fix the latch on. For a long moment he lay still, certain the whole night had been some strange, elaborate dream brought on by an empty stomach and too much rain. Then he sat up, and the world tilted, sharpened, and rearranged itself around him in ways that made his stomach lurch. He could hear the baker 3 streets over rolling out dough. He could hear a cat arguing with another cat somewhere behind the building, and beneath that, fainter, the specific rustle of a bird settling into a nest 2 rooftops away. He could smell rain that had long since stopped falling, and beneath the rain, the green, mineral scent of moss on stone, though there was no moss anywhere near his apartment that he had ever noticed. When he looked down at his own hands in the thin light, the shadows they cast seemed, for just a moment, longer and sharper than they should have been, the way an animal's shadow falls at dusk. He scrambled up and pressed his back to the wall, breathing hard, waiting for the strangeness to fade the way dreams were supposed to fade. It did not fade. If anything, the longer he stood there, the more solid it became, until he was forced to admit that either he had lost his mind sometime in the night, or every word the woman in the clearing had said to him had been entirely, impossibly true. He pushed up his sleeve without quite deciding to, and there, on the inside of his left wrist, was a mark that had not been there before. A crescent moon, thin as a hairline scar, cradling a single small arrow. It did not hurt. It did not glow, or hum, or do anything dramatic at all. It simply sat on his skin like it had always belonged there, patient and quiet, waiting to be noticed. "Okay," he said out loud, to the empty room, in the same habit of talking to no one that had gotten him into this in the first place. "Okay. That happened. That definitely happened." He got dressed with hands that would not quite stop shaking, less from cold than from the enormous, unfamiliar sensation of having been chosen by something, by someone, for the very first time in his life. He was halfway through pulling on his sandals when he felt it, a presence at the edge of the room, patient and still, the way a held breath is still. He looked up expecting nothing, the way he always expected nothing, and found a wolf sitting in the doorway to his kitchen. It was not large, not fully grown, more pup than wolf really, with fur the pale silver gray of moonlight on old ash and eyes the same calm, ancient color as the ones that had watched him from the tree line the night before. It did not growl. It did not flatten its ears or bare its teeth the way the village dogs sometimes did when he passed too close. It simply watched him, tail giving one slow, deliberate sweep across the floor, the unmistakable gesture of a creature that has decided, quietly and completely, that the person in front of it belongs to it now. "You're not really here, are you?" Naruto said, more statement than question, crouching slowly so as not to startle it, though something told him this animal did not startle easily. "You're like a spirit thing." From her. The wolf pup rose, padded across the kitchen floor without a single sound, and pressed its head firmly against his outstretched palm, solid and warm and entirely, undeniably real beneath his fingers. Naruto laughed, a short, disbelieving sound that cracked in the middle, because it had been so long since anything in his life had chosen to come close to him on purpose that he had genuinely forgotten what it felt like. "Okay," he said again, softer this time, running his hand along the pup's ears while it leaned bodily into the touch. "Okay. I guess I've got a wolf now." Somewhere far beneath the wolf's warmth, in the deep dark place where the fox had slept curled and silent for as long as Naruto had been alive, something old and enormous shifted, opened one eye it had not opened in 7 years, and for the first time, took real notice of the small boy carrying it. "Interesting," said a voice that was not his own, rumbling up from somewhere below his ribs, so unexpected that Naruto nearly fell over backward onto the wolf. "A goddess of the hunt, marking my container as her own. This village has no idea what it has been mistreating. ***. Chapter 4. Naruto did fall over, though not backward. He landed hard on his tailbone with a yelp that sent the wolf pup skittering back a step, ears pricked in what might have been concern or might have simply been curiosity at the noise. Who said that? He demanded of the empty kitchen, scrambling back to his feet, heart hammering. Is somebody in here? No one is in your kitchen, boy. I am considerably harder to hide than that. The voice rolled through him again, low and immense, less heard than felt, vibrating up from somewhere behind his navel. Though I suppose 7 years is a very long time to go without anyone bothering to explain what lives in your gut. The old woman at the orphanage had told him things, over the years, in the careless way adults sometimes let slip truths they assumed a child was too young to understand. A monster. A demon sealed away the night he was born. He had spent years half believing it was a cruel story invented to explain why people flinched from him, and the other half of the time believing it, and hating himself for it in the quiet dark of his room. You're the fox, he said slowly. The one everybody says is inside me. Kurama, the voice corrected, with an edge of old, tired irritation. Not the fox. I had a name for longer than your entire village has existed, and I would appreciate it being used. A pause, long enough that Naruto began to wonder if that was the whole conversation. Then, quieter, almost grudging, though I admit I did not expect to be woken this particular morning by the scent of a goddess's blessing sitting on top of my seal like frost on a window. You know her? Artemis? I know of her domain. Wild places. The hunt. The protection of what is small and easily preyed upon. Something that might have been a low, rough laugh rumbled through Naruto's chest. It is, I will grudgingly admit, a fitting choice. You have spent 7 years being hunted by a village too foolish to recognize what it caged. There is a certain justice in you becoming something that hunts in turn, not them, but whatever preys on children just like the one you were last night, alone in the rain. Naruto sat back down on the kitchen floor, more slowly this time, and the wolf pup came and pressed itself against his side as though it understood, in whatever way spirit animals understood things, that he needed the weight of something warm beside him. He had spent his whole life being told what he was by people who flinched at the sight of him. He had never once, until last night, been told what he might become by someone who was actually looking at him when they said it. Is this bad? He asked, quiet now, all the earlier excitement gone thin and uncertain. Having 2 things living in me? You, and whatever she did? She did not put anything in you that was not already there, Kurama said, and something in the enormous voice had gentled, fractionally, the way a storm sometimes gentles at its center. From what I can sense, she has simply recognized the shape your spirit was already growing into and given it a name and a purpose. That is not an invasion. That is closer to a mentor noticing a student before the student has noticed themselves. A pause. As for us sharing you, I have had 7 years to grow accustomed to your company, brat, whether I wished to or not. I am hardly threatened by a goddess who values the same things I have watched you value on your own, with no one to teach you to. Loyalty. Mercy for creatures smaller than yourself. Stubbornness in the face of a world that gave you every reason to become cruel. It was, Naruto realized with something like wonder, the kindest thing anyone or anything had ever said to him, and it had come from the very thing he had spent years being warned to fear. Outside, far above the village he had never once been able to call home in any way that felt true. The sky was clearing after the night's storm, pale morning light breaking clean and cold across rooftops that had never once looked warm to him. For the first time in longer than he could remember, Naruto found he was not dreading the day ahead of him. He got up, the wolf pup rising with him, shadowing his every movement as though it had always been there, and went to find something to eat before the academy bell rang, feeling, for the first time in his short life, less alone in his own skin than he had ever been. Chapter 5. The wolf pup did not have a name for 3 days, mostly because Naruto could not decide on one that felt big enough. He tried a dozen, muttering them under his breath on the walk to the academy while the pup trotted invisibly beside him, unseen by everyone but him, and rejected each one in turn. It was Kurama, in the end, gruff and unimpressed as ever, who put an end to the debate. She is a piece of a moon goddess's regard given shape and fur, the fox rumbled one evening, while Naruto sat cross-legged on his apartment floor scratching behind the pup's ears. Name her for the moon and be done with it. You are overthinking a decision a hunter would make in a single glance. Asterisk. Tsukiko, Naruto said, testing the word, and the pup's ears swiveled toward him, tail sweeping once across the floor in unmistakable approval. Moon child. Yeah. That fits you. Tsukiko, it turned out, was not merely a companion. She was, Naruto came to understand over the following weeks, something closer to a teacher who could not speak in words but taught anyway, the way animals had always taught their young long before anyone invented a classroom for it. She would not let him walk carelessly through the trees behind his apartment building, nudging his ankle sharply with her nose whenever he snapped a twig too loudly or let his weight fall wrong on wet leaves. She sat beside him in patient stillness for hours at a time until his own fidgeting settled into something quieter, teaching him without a single word that stillness itself was a skill, one most people never bothered to learn. He began sneaking out before dawn, when the streets were empty enough that no one could see a boy walking with an invisible wolf at his heel, and Tsukiko led him through the tangled green edges of the village where the forest pressed closest to the wall. She showed him, in the only language she had, how to read a trail, a bent blade of grass, a print half filled with dew, the particular hush that fell over birdsong when something larger moved through the undergrowth nearby. He was clumsy at first, loud and impatient in the way children are loud and impatient, and she corrected him each time with nothing more than a look or a low, disapproving huff, until slowly, stubbornly, he began to get it right. How do you know all this stuff? He asked her one gray morning, crouched beside a print in the mud that she had made him find on his own, 3 times, before she would let him move on. Did she teach you? Artemis? Tsukiko only tilted her head at him, silver eyes patient, and Naruto had the strange, growing sense that the question did not quite make sense to her, the way asking a bird how it knew to fly did not quite make sense to the bird. She was not taught, Kurama offered, from somewhere behind his ribs, sounding almost amused. She is instinct-given form. Everything she knows, she has always known, the same way water has always known how to find the lowest ground. You are the one being taught, boy. She is simply the shape the lesson comes in. Asterisk. It should have unsettled him, maybe, having a fox and a wolf and the ghost of a goddess all quietly reshaping the way he moved through the world. Instead it felt like the opposite of unsettling. It felt, for the first time since he could remember, like being held up rather than pushed down, like a hand steadying him instead of a dozen hands shoving him away. He came home each morning with mud on his knees and leaves in his hair and for once did not mind the empty apartment waiting for him, because it did not feel quite as empty anymore. Tsukiko curled at the foot of his bed each night, a warm silver weight he could not always see but could always, unmistakably, feel, and Kurama's presence settled beside him like an old, gruff sentry standing watch over both of them. He was still the boy the village crossed the street to avoid. He was still the boy with no family photographs on his walls and no one to sign his academy forms but a tired clerk who barely looked up from her desk. But underneath all of that, quietly, patiently, something new was taking root in him, and for the first time in his life, Naruto Uzumaki began to suspect that loneliness might not be the only thing waiting for him at the end of every day. Chapter 6. The academy had never been kind to him, and it was not kindness, exactly, that changed on the morning of the lost child, but something adjacent to it, the first crack of light through a door that had been shut for years. It began with Konohamaru Sarutobi, though Naruto did not know the boy's name yet, only that he was small, maybe 4 years old, and standing alone and wailing at the mouth of an alley 2 streets from the market, having wandered off from a nurse who had turned her back for the length of a single distracted moment. A crowd had gathered the way crowds do, more interested in watching the spectacle than solving it, adults calling half-hearted questions the boy was too frightened to answer, no one quite committing to the work of actually helping. Naruto might have walked past once. He had learned early that inserting himself into situations where adults were already gathered rarely ended well for him. But Tsukiko, trotting invisible at his side, went suddenly rigid, nose lifted, and a low sound rose in her throat that was not quite a growl, more an urgent, pointed alertness, and Naruto found himself stopping without deciding to. He crouched at the edge of the crowd where no one paid him any attention, and closed his eyes the way Tsukiko had been teaching him to, letting the noise of raised voices fall away until he could pick out smaller things beneath it. The boy's frightened, ragged breathing, and underneath that, fainter, a rhythm of footsteps moving away down a side path no one else seemed to have thought to check, small and hurried and confused. He went that way, Naruto said, louder than he meant to, pointing down the narrow lane between a tailor's shop and a shuttered tea house. A few adults turned to look at him with the particular wary suspicion he had long since stopped being surprised by. The little kid. Somebody who got separated from him went down there. I can hear footsteps. No one moved. No one believed him, not really, not the boy the whole street usually crossed to avoid. But the crying had stopped, and in the sudden quiet a woman near the front of the crowd frowned, listening, and caught the faint scuff of small sandals against stone drifting back from the direction Naruto had pointed. She went. 2 others followed. And a few minutes later they returned with a small, tearful boy in the woman's arms, unhurt, only frightened, having wandered further than anyone realized while chasing a stray cat down the very lane Naruto had named. How did you know that? The woman asked him afterward, studying him with an expression he did not entirely recognize on a stranger's face, something between confusion and grudging respect. He almost lied. He almost shrugged and said he'd guessed. But Tsukiko's steady presence at his side, and the memory of silver eyes in a rain-soaked clearing telling him he would never again wonder if he was seen, made him lift his chin instead. I'm good at finding things, he said simply. I like tracking stuff. Animals, mostly. But people too, I guess. It was such a small moment, in the grand accounting of a life. A woman he would likely never speak to again, thanking him with genuine warmth instead of the careful, distant politeness he was used to, ruffling his hair the way people sometimes ruffled the hair of children they actually liked. But Naruto carried it home with him like something precious, turning it over and over in his mind the way a person turns over the first coin they have ever earned honestly. You see, Kurama said quietly that night, as Naruto lay staring at his ceiling, unable to stop smiling even in the dark where no one could see it. This is what she meant, when she spoke of being seen. Not because the whole village suddenly loves you. One woman, ruffling your hair because you helped find a frightened child. That is how it begins. Slowly. Honestly. One true thing at a time. Instead of a village deciding to love you all at once for no reason at all. Tsukiko, curled invisible at the foot of his bed, gave a low, contented huff, and for once Naruto did not lie awake counting all the ways the day could have gone worse. He fell asleep instead thinking of the small boy's relieved sobbing, and the woman's genuine smile, and the strange, growing certainty that he had found, at last, something he was good at that had nothing to do with pranks or noise or the desperate need to be noticed by any means available. He was good at finding what was lost. He intended to get better at it. The next morning, word of the incident had already made its small, ordinary way around the neighborhood, the way such things did in a village where gossip traveled faster than any messenger hawk. He did not expect anyone at the academy to have heard, and mostly no one had, except for a boy 2 seats over named Kiba Inuzuka, who fixed him with a long, considering look during the lunch break instead of the usual careless disregard. My mom says a fox brat found the Sarutobi kid before anybody else even figured out which way to look, Kiba said, not unkindly, more curious than anything, his own small dog dozing in the hood of his jacket. Said you just closed your eyes and pointed. That true? Naruto braced, out of long habit, for the sentence to turn cruel the way most sentences about him eventually did. It did not. Kiba only studied him a moment longer, then shrugged with the easy, uncomplicated acceptance of a boy raised among hunting dogs, for whom a sharp nose and a good ear were simply useful things to have, not something to fear. That's actually kind of cool, Kiba said, and went back to his lunch, and Naruto sat there for a long moment afterward, oddly light, turning the small, unremarkable compliment over and over like a coin he intended to keep. Chapter 7. Hiruzen Sarutobi had not survived 3 wars and 5 decades in the Hokage's chair by ignoring reports that did not quite fit the shape of the world as he understood it, and the report that landed on his desk that week did not fit at all. It came from an ANBU routinely assigned to the general safety of the village's more vulnerable residents, a quiet, thankless duty that included, without any special fanfare, a periodic and distant watch over Naruto Uzumaki. The report was short. A child had been found by locating a lost boy's trail through a method the reporting shinobi, a jonin with 2 decades of tracking experience, could not entirely explain. There had been no visible technique. No hand seals. Only a small boy closing his eyes in a crowded street and pointing, with total, quiet certainty, in a direction that turned out to be exactly correct. Hiruzen read the report twice, set it down, and sat for a long while with his pipe unlit in his hand, looking out the window at the village he had spent his life trying to protect and had, in certain specific and unforgivable ways, failed to protect at all. He knew what lived sealed inside the boy. He had signed the order himself, in grief and desperation, on the worst night of his life. But this report described something else entirely, something that did not smell of the fox's chakra at all, something colder and cleaner and older, like moonlight on still water. It took him 3 days of careful, private research, working alone in the restricted archive after hours so that no assistant would ask questions he was not yet ready to answer, before he found what he was looking for. A single scroll, brittle with age, tucked into a section of the archive so old it predated even the Senju and Uchiha founding of the village, describing a wooded grove somewhere within the borders of what would eventually become the Land of Fire, marked on old maps only as sacred, and forbidden to hunters. The scroll spoke, in language faded and formal and half swallowed by time, of a huntress spirit who occasionally, rarely, across centuries, chose a mortal child as her own. It called such a child a ward of the Silver Bough. It described the signs by which such a child might be recognized, an uncanny stillness in the wild places, an unnatural rapport with animals who ordinarily fled from strangers, and a mark, small and easily missed, shaped like a crescent moon cradling an arrow. Hiruzen set the scroll down with hands that were not quite steady, and thought, with the particular ache of a man who has made peace with many regrets but never fully forgiven himself for any of them, of a small boy alone in an apartment with no one to explain to him what was happening inside his own body. He did not summon Naruto. Not yet. He was too old, and had made too many mistakes born of moving too quickly, to risk frightening a child who had clearly already found, on his own, in the dark, something the whole apparatus of the village had failed for years to give him, a reason to keep believing the world was not entirely against him. Instead, he called for the boy's academy instructor, a young, earnest chunin named Irika Yumino who had shown, in his brief time teaching, an unusual and stubborn insistence on treating every student fairly regardless of what the village said about their bloodlines. "I am not going to tell you everything," Hiruzen said, when Irika stood before his desk, visibly bracing for bad news the way young shinobi often did in that office. "But I want you to watch Naruto Uzumaki more closely than you have been. Not with suspicion. With care. If you notice anything unusual, anything at all, however small, I want to know, and I want you to tell no one else." "Has he done something wrong, Hokage-sama?" "No," Hiruzen said, and something in his old, tired face softened in a way that made Irika's braced shoulders ease slightly. "Quite the opposite, I believe. I think something in this world has finally decided to be kind to that boy, Irika, and I intend to make certain the village does not accidentally trample it before it has the chance to grow." He did not explain further. He would, eventually, when the time was right and the boy was ready to hear it. For now, he simply resolved, in the quiet privacy of his own conscience, to do something he had not always managed in the 7 years since the sealing, to actually pay attention. Chapter 8. Irika Yumino began watching, quietly, the way Hiruzen had asked, and what he saw over the following weeks reshaped, gently and permanently, the way he thought about the loudest, most disruptive student in his classroom. He noticed it first in small things. The way Naruto, who fidgeted and shouted and could not sit through a lecture on chakra theory without 3 separate interruptions, went utterly, unnaturally still during the Academy's brief unit on tracking and survival, absorbing every word as though it were the only subject that had ever mattered to him. The way stray cats that hissed and fled from every other student in the yard would trot directly across the training ground to sit beside Naruto's feet, entirely unbothered, and stay there through an entire lunch period. The way, on the rare mornings Naruto arrived early, Iruka sometimes caught him crouched at the edge of the practice field studying a bird's nest or a beetle's trail with an intensity most 7-year-olds reserved for far more exciting things. He said nothing to Naruto directly. He simply began, without making a show of it, to give the boy small opportunities that let whatever this new stillness was breathe a little. A tracking exercise here. A quiet word of praise there, given plainly and without the exaggerated caution most adults used around him, as though he might shatter or explode depending on the tone. Naruto, who had spent years learning to expect either indifference or scorn from adults, seemed almost bewildered by ordinary, unremarkable kindness, and Iruka found that particular bewilderment harder to witness than any of the village's open cruelty had ever been. Meanwhile, unseen by any of them, Naruto's nights had begun to change in earnest. He had taken, on Sakiko's silent insistence, to climbing out to the small overgrown rooftop garden behind his apartment building on clear nights, where the moon fell unobstructed and the city noise thinned to almost nothing. He did not fully understand what he was doing there, only that his skin prickled with something like recognition each time moonlight touched it directly, the way a plant leans without conscious thought toward a window. It was on one such night, 3 weeks after the clearing, that he first felt the pull towards something solid. He had been sitting cross-legged, Sakiko curled against his side, simply existing in the quiet the way she had taught him to, when a warmth gathered in his palms unbidden, silver and cool rather than hot, nothing like the buzzing orange heat he sometimes felt when Kurama's chakra stirred beneath the surface. He looked down, startled, and found threads of pale light curling between his fingers like mist given shape, resolving, slowly and unsteadily, into the outline of something long and curved. "Do not force it," Kurama rumbled, sounding almost interested despite himself. "This is not chakra molded the way your instructors will eventually teach you. It answers to intention and stillness, not effort. You are trying to grip water. Let it settle instead. ****. Naruto exhaled, the way Sakiko's steady, patient stillness had slowly taught his restless body to do, and let his hands go soft rather than tense. The light steadied. By the time it finished forming, a bow rested across his palms, small, sized to his own child's frame, pale as bone and cool to the touch, strung with something that looked like woven moonlight and felt, when he ran a thumb across it, faintly, impossibly alive. He nearly dropped it in shock. It did not vanish. It sat solid and real in his hands, and when he finally worked up the courage to draw the string back, an arrow of the same pale light formed against it without him summoning it consciously at all, as though the bow itself understood what it was for even if he did not yet. He did not loose it. He was not ready, not yet, and some deep instinct told him this was not a toy to be tested carelessly on a rooftop in the dark. He simply sat there for a long while, bow in his lap, Sakiko's head resting against his knee, and let himself feel, for the first time in his life, something that was entirely, unmistakably his own. Not a gift given out of pity. Not a scrap thrown to keep him quiet. A weapon, and a purpose, offered by someone who had looked at everything the village saw in him and chosen, instead, to see something worth arming. Chapter 9. Not every eye that turned toward Naruto Uzumaki that season did so with kindness in mind. Danzo Shimura had built the better part of his life's work on the careful, patient collection of information others overlooked, and it was in that spirit that a brief, dry note eventually crossed his desk from one of the many quiet, unofficial watchers he maintained throughout the village, unbeholden to the Hokage's official reporting lines. The note described, in the flat and clinical language his operatives were trained to use, an unusual pattern of behavior in the Kyuubi's container, an unnatural affinity for tracking, a growing rapport with local wildlife that bordered on the impossible, and most interesting of all, a faint but unmistakable secondary chakra signature that did not match the fox's at all. Danzo read the note twice, set it aside, and allowed himself, for a rare moment, something close to genuine curiosity. He had always considered the Kyuubi's container a resource criminally mismanaged, a weapon of incalculable value left to rot untrained and unguided out of Hiruzen's sentimental refusal to see the boy as anything other than a grieving village's collective guilt made flesh. Danzo had made several careful, deniable attempts over the years to insert root influence into the boy's upbringing, all of them blocked, quietly but firmly, by Hiruzen's watchful protection. He had, for the most part, resigned himself to waiting for the boy to grow old enough that such protection would no longer extend so easily. This report changed the calculation. A second power, layered atop the first, awakening on its own with no instruction and no cost to the village's resources. If it could be identified, understood, and properly directed, it represented precisely the kind of asset Root had been built to cultivate, something extraordinary, made obedient, made useful, made silent. He summoned the operative responsible for the report to his private chamber that evening, a masked figure who knelt without a word and waited to be addressed. "Continue observation," Danzo said, his single visible eye fixed on the middle distance the way it always was when he was turning a long game over in his mind. "Do not approach the boy. Do not interact with him in any capacity that could be traced. I want to know the extent of this new ability before I decide how it might best be cultivated." A pause, brief and considering. "And find out what, precisely, is responsible for it. A bloodline the Uzumaki clan never documented would be worth understanding thoroughly before anyone else in this village stumbles onto its existence." The operative bowed and vanished without a sound, leaving Danzo alone with his thoughts and the slow, patient calculations of a man who had spent his entire life believing that sentiment was a luxury the village could not afford and that anything of value, given time and the proper hand to guide it, could eventually be made to serve a greater purpose. He did not yet know what he was watching. He had no name for a goddess of the hunt, no framework in his considerable knowledge of shinobi bloodlines and forbidden techniques for a mark shaped like a crescent moon cradling an arrow. But Danzo Shimura had built an empire of shadows on the simple, patient principle that ignorance was merely a temporary condition, and he intended to correct it, quietly, at his own pace, long before the boy himself understood what he had truly become. Far above the village, in a place no report of his would ever reach, a goddess who had watched empires rise and fall over the collection and control of things too wild to be tamed felt the faint, distant press of a mortal's calculating attention settle on her chosen, and was not troubled by it in the slightest. She had, after all, dealt with hunters who mistook themselves for the hunt many times before, across many worlds, and every single one of them had eventually learned, to their considerable cost, precisely how mistaken they had been. Danzo, unaware of any of this, spent that same evening reviewing older files he had not touched in years, records of the few known bloodlines said to grant unusual rapport with animals, half-remembered fragments of pre-founding folklore his own teachers had dismissed as superstition unworthy of serious study, and a short list of missing Nin and rogue collectors known to trade in relics from supposedly haunted or sacred ground. One name surfaced twice in his notes before the night was through, tied loosely to black market reports of illegal hunting near the old boundary stones east of the village, a broker operating under the alias Renson, believed to deal almost exclusively in trophies and materials taken from places locals still, in defiance of all modern reason, refused to enter after dark. It was, Danzo thought, filing the name away with the same patient precision he applied to everything, very likely nothing. Superstitious villagers avoided a great many ordinary places for a great many foolish reasons. But he had built his life's work on refusing to dismiss coincidence too quickly, and he made a private note to have the matter looked into further, alongside the boy, at his own unhurried pace, when it suited him. Chapter 10. It was Tsukiko who found the wrongness first, on a night 3 weeks later, well past the hour Naruto should have been asleep. He had grown used to her small signals by then, the way her ears pinned back at the scent of something rotten hidden beneath honest smells, the low stillness that meant danger rather than simple caution. That night, curled on his rooftop under a moon 2 nights short of full, she went suddenly, completely rigid, nose lifted toward the forest beyond the village wall, a thin, unhappy whine building in her throat that he had never heard from her before. "What is it?" he whispered, sitting up fast. "Tsukiko, what's wrong?" She did not answer, could not answer, not in words, but she rose and paced the edge of the rooftop with an agitation that made his own chest tighten in sympathy before he even understood why. Blood, Kurama said quietly, and something in the enormous voice had gone flat and cold in a way Naruto had not heard before. Old blood, and fresh blood, and the particular reek of creatures killed carelessly, for parts rather than need. She smells a slaughter, boy. Somewhere in the forest her mistress claims as sacred ground. Asterisk asterisk. Naruto was on his feet before he had finished processing the sentence, the pale bow already forming half-formed in his hands out of nothing more than urgency and instinct. We have to go look. You are 7 years old, Kurama said, though there was less real objection in it than the words suggested. Whatever is doing this is not. I don't care. Naruto was already climbing down the drainpipe at the corner of the building, Tsukiko a silver blur ahead of him, moving with a purpose she had never shown before, all patient stillness burned away by something closer to fury. She said I was supposed to protect things smaller than me. I'm not gonna just go back to bed because I'm scared. He expected an argument. He got, instead, a long pause, and then, grudgingly, almost approving, then moved quietly, and let the wolf lead. Stubbornness is a fine quality, boy, but it has gotten better men than you killed when it outran their sense. Asterisk asterisk. The village at that hour was empty enough to slip through unseen, and the forest, when he reached it, felt entirely different from the hushed, welcoming stillness of the night he had first found the clearing. The air here was wrong, sharp with the copper smell of blood and the acrid bite of something chemical underneath it, foreign to any wound a natural predator might leave. Tsukiko led him low and fast through the undergrowth, and it was not long before he heard it, voices, low and businesslike, and beneath them, the ragged, panicked breathing of something large and badly hurt. He crept to the edge of a small clearing and found, in the moon's cold light, 3 men in dark, unmarked cloaks crouched around the body of a great stag, its antlers already half sawn away, dark bindweed rope still cinched cruel and tight around its hind legs. It was alive. Barely. Its flanks heaved in shallow, agonized breaths, one dark eye rolling toward the boy crouched frozen at the tree-lean as though it could see, in him, some last, desperate hope. Nearly done, one of the men muttered, working a curved blade against the base of the second antler. Whole set's worth more than the pelt anyway. Master Renson's paying triple for anything taken from inside the old boundary markers. Says the ground here still carries some kind of charge. Naruto's hands had gone very still around the half-formed bough, and for the first time since the clearing, since the rain, since a goddess had knelt before him and told him he would never again wonder if anyone was watching, he understood, with total and unshakable clarity, exactly what he had been chosen for. Chapter 11. He did not charge in. Even with fury burning cold and clean through his chest, something in him, some new instinct Tsukiko's weeks of patient teaching had planted deep, held him back long enough to think. 3 of them, armed, and you are 7, Kurama said, low and urgent. Fury will get the stag killed faster, not slower. Use what she gave you. Do not waste it on a mistake you cannot take back. Asterisk asterisk. Naruto swallowed hard, forced his breathing to slow the way Tsukiko had drilled into him on a dozen quiet mornings, and let his eyes move across the clearing the way she had taught him to read a trail, not at what was loud and obvious, but at what mattered. 3 men, none of them expecting resistance from anything smaller than a village patrol. A stag too weak and too bound to help itself. A single narrow gap in the tree-lean behind them where the moon fell brightest, unobstructed by canopy. He knocked the arrow that had not fully finished forming, feeling it solidify the instant his intention around it sharpened, and loosed it not at the man with the blade, but at the rope binding the stag's hind legs, catching it clean and true in the dark. The bindweed rope parted with a soft, silvery hiss, and the stag, freed and terrified, lurched upright and crashed away into the underbrush before any of the 3 men had finished spinning toward the sound. Who's there? The nearest one snarled, already moving, blade coming up. Naruto stepped out from the tree-lean anyway, small and soaked in cold sweat and entirely unwilling to let that stop him, bow drawn and steady in a way that surprised even himself. Get away from here, he said, and was faintly astonished by how little his voice shook. This is her ground. You're not allowed to hurt anything here. The men laughed, the ugly, dismissive laugh of adults who see only a child and nothing behind him worth taking seriously, and that was, as it turned out, their first and worst mistake. The nearest one lunged, blade flashing silver in the moonlight, and Naruto, moving on instinct built from weeks of drills he had not even known were drills, dropped low and rolled clear the way Tsukiko had made him practice 100 frustrating times on wet grass he had complained about every single morning. He came up already loosing a second arrow, aimed not to kill, some deep unshakable instinct in him utterly certain that was not what this power was for, but true enough to strike the man's sword arm and send the blades spinning into the underbrush with a cry of real pain. A second man moved to flank him, and Tsukiko met him head-on, no longer invisible now that the danger was real and immediate, silver and snarling and far larger somehow than the pup Naruto had known for 3 weeks, driving the man back with teeth bared and eyes blazing with a fury that belonged to something far older than any wolf born in an ordinary forest. It was the third man who nearly ended it. He came from the side while Naruto's attention was split, blade already falling toward a boy too small and too outnumbered to fully defend himself, and it was in that single suspended heartbeat, between the blade's descent and Naruto's too slow attempt to twist away, that silver light exploded soundlessly across the clearing, and a shape both familiar and impossibly larger folded itself, for just an instant, around the small boy at its center. The blade struck something that was not flesh, rang like metal against ancient stone, and the man staggered back with a cry, his weapon shattered at the hilt. Above Naruto, visible for the barest fraction of a second before the light receded, stood the ghost of an enormous stag, antlers spread wide as open arms, standing between him and the blade the way a mother stands between her child and the world. The 3 men did not wait to understand what they had just seen. They fled into the dark, one clutching a ruined arm, another staring back over his shoulder with the particular white-faced terror of men who have just glimpsed something they will spend the rest of their lives trying to convince themselves they imagined. Naruto stood in the sudden quiet, chest heaving, bow still glowing faint in his shaking hands. Tsukiko pressed hard against his side, and felt, beneath the adrenaline and the fear only now catching up to him, something else entirely, the deep, settling certainty that he had just done, for the very first time in his life, exactly what he was meant to do. His legs gave out a moment later, and he sat down hard in the wet grass, shaking now in earnest, the bow dissolving back into threads of pale light between his fingers as the last of whatever had carried him through the fight drained away all at once. Tsukiko pressed against him, solid and warm, and he buried one hand in her fur and let himself simply breathe for a while, not proud of the fear now that it had caught up with him, only grateful that it had waited until the danger had passed. "I didn't kill anybody," he said aloud, half question and half relief, needing to hear it confirmed by someone even if that someone lived behind his own ribs. "No," Kurama said, quieter than usual. "You wounded them enough to send them running, and no more than that. Some hunters take a long time to learn that lesson. You seem to have arrived already knowing it." A pause, almost thoughtful. "Your goddess chose well, brat. I will grant her that much without complaint." Chapter 12. He found the stag again an hour later, favoring its wounded leg but alive, sheltering in a stand of birch not far from the clearing where the ancient stones still stood beneath its crown of ivy. It did not flee from him this time. It watched him approach with an eye that seemed, in the moonlight, far too knowing for an ordinary animal, and allowed him to sit nearby, silent and exhausted, until its ragged breathing evened out into something calmer. "You did well tonight," Kurama said eventually, quiet and, for once, entirely without irony. "Better than well. You had every reason to charge in blind and be cut down for it, and you did not. That restraint will keep you alive far longer than raw courage ever could on its own." "They hurt him because of her," Naruto said, nodding at the stag, voice still not quite steady. "Because this is her ground. That guy said something about a master paying more for stuff from inside the old boundary. Then someone out there already knows more about what this place is than your village does," Kurama said, and the words settled into Naruto's chest with a weight he did not yet have the experience to fully understand, only the instinct to recognize as important. "Remember that name, boy. Rensen. Names have a way of mattering later, even when they seem like nothing at the time. He walked home as the sky was beginning, faintly, to lighten toward dawn, Tsukiko once more small and quiet and invisible at his side, as though the fierce, snarling creature from the clearing had simply been folded away and put back in her pocket. He was exhausted in a way he had never been exhausted before, bone-deep and strange, and yet beneath the exhaustion ran something bright and unfamiliar and entirely new, the quiet, settled feeling of a person who has finally found the shape of the life they are meant to live. He was not there to see it, but far above the village, in whatever place a goddess kept her attention when she was not walking as a doe through mortal forests, Artemis watched the whole of it unfold with an expression that might, on anyone less ancient, and less accustomed to hiding her feelings, have been called pride. He fought to protect what could not protect itself, at 7 years old, alone, without a single lesson in real combat behind him, she said, to no one in particular, or perhaps to the moon itself, which had always been the closest thing she kept to a confidant. Karama chose restraint over blind courage and taught him well in doing it. The old fox and I may disagree on a great many things, but we do not disagree on this. She let her attention drift, briefly, toward a masked figure crouched at the tree lean half a mile from where the boy now walked home, watching, reporting back to a man with a bandaged eye and a very old, very patient plan for how a Jinchuriki's power might best be harvested and controlled. She felt, distantly, the shape of that ambition, and was entirely unmoved by it, the way a mountain is unmoved by weather. Watch him if you must, she thought, with the calm, immovable patience of something that had outlasted 1,000 such schemes before. Plan for him if it comforts you. But the boy you are watching is not a weapon waiting to be picked up and pointed at a target of your choosing. He is a hunter now, in the oldest and truest sense of the word, and hunters, in the end, always learn to see the hand reaching for their leash long before that hand ever manages to close. Below, unaware of the goddess's quiet vigilance, or the watcher hidden in the trees behind him, Naruto Uzumaki climbed back through his own window as the first true light of morning broke over Konoha, fell into bed still dressed, Tsukiko curling warm and solid against his side, and slept, for the first time in longer than he could remember, without a single bad dream to trouble him. Somewhere ahead of him, unseen and unhurried, a much larger world was only just beginning to notice he existed. Chapter 13. 2 months passed, and the boy who had once stood soaked and shivering in a rain-drowned clearing began, slowly and without fully realizing it, to move through the world like someone who belonged in it. The change was small enough that most of the village never noticed it at all. Naruto Uzumaki was still loud in the ways that mattered least, still prone to grinning too wide and talking too fast when someone finally paid him attention, still the boy's shopkeepers watched a beat too long whenever he lingered near a shelf. But underneath the noise, something steadier had taken root. He no longer flinched quite so hard at silence. He no longer filled every quiet moment with desperate chatter, because for the first time in his life, silence did not feel like being forgotten. It felt like Tsukiko curled invisible against his ankle, patient and warm, and Kurama's low, watchful presence settled somewhere behind his ribs, and the memory of silver eyes that had promised, on a night he replayed more often than he would admit, that he would never again wonder if anyone was watching. He trained now with a discipline no one had ever taught him to have, rising before dawn to run the tree line behind his apartment building, moving low and quiet through undergrowth that had once tripped him at every step and now, gradually, began to yield to him the way it yielded to something that belonged there. Tsukiko drilled him relentlessly and without mercy, in the wordless, patient way she had from the very beginning, correcting a careless footfall with a sharp nudge, rewarding a clean, silent approach with nothing more than a slow sweep of her tail, which had somehow, over the weeks, come to feel like the highest praise he had ever received. "You're getting faster," Iruka told him one morning, after a tracking drill during academy hours in which Naruto had located every one of the 6 hidden markers scattered through the training ground nearly twice as fast as any other student, moving with an unhurried, methodical calm that looked nothing like his usual chaotic energy. "I don't think I've ever seen you concentrate like that on anything." "It's different than sitting still in class," Naruto admitted, scuffing his sandal against the dirt, still faintly embarrassed by praise he had not yet learned how to simply accept without deflecting it. This stuff actually makes sense to me. I don't know why. Iruka did know why, or at least suspected he did, though Hiruzen had asked him to say nothing yet, and he kept his word, watching the boy with a quiet, careful warmth he was careful not to let show too plainly. It was strange, he thought, watching Naruto crouch at the base of a tree to study a scuffed patch of bark with total, absorbed focus, how quickly a person's understanding of someone could shift once you started actually paying attention instead of simply reacting to the noise they made to survive being ignored. That evening, on the rooftop where moonlight fell clean and unbroken, Naruto sat with the bow half formed in his lap, practicing the trick of letting it come and go without startling himself each time, and found his thoughts drifting, as they often did lately, toward the woman in the clearing. "Do you think she's watching right now?" he asked, half to Tsukiko and half to the sky itself, in the easy, unself-conscious way he had gotten used to talking to beings who might or might not be listening. "She is always watching, in her way," Kurama rumbled, sounding neither impressed nor dismissive, simply stating a fact the way he stated most things. Gods rarely look away entirely from something they have chosen to claim. It is one of the few qualities they share with a fox who has spent 7 years watching a boy grow into someone worth watching. It was, Naruto had come to understand, as close as Kurama ever came to saying something warm outright, and he had learned to take it exactly as it was meant, not loudly, not with any great show of sentiment, but real all the same. The way the bow in his hands was real, the way Tsukiko's weight against his side was real, the way the whole quiet architecture of his new life had begun, brick by careful brick, to feel like something that might actually last. He did not know yet that somewhere beyond the village walls, a broker who traded in the bones and antlers of sacred things had received a very unhappy report from 3 men who could not fully explain what had driven them out of a forest they had entered expecting easy, unguarded prey. He did not know that the name Rensen, unfamiliar and meaningless to him, had already begun, patiently and deliberately, to turn its attention toward the small, strange resistance that had cost him a night's profit and 3 good men's nerve. For now, on his rooftop under a rising moon, he only knew that he was, for the first time he could remember, looking forward to tomorrow. The days settled into a rhythm he had never had the luxury of before. Dawn runs through the tree line, academy lessons that no longer felt like a wall to be endured, evenings spent quietly cross-legged beneath the moon with the bow forming and dissolving between his palms until the motion felt less like summoning something foreign and more like flexing a muscle he had simply never known he possessed. Even the ordinary, mundane parts of his life began to feel different in the glow of it. The old woman who ran the corner grocery, who had spent years watching him with the same wary caution she reserved for stray dogs, began, without any particular ceremony, to set aside the bruised fruit she could no longer sell rather than throw it out, and to let him take it home without comment. It was not friendship, not exactly, not yet, but it was the first small crack in the wall he had once believed permanent, and Naruto, who noticed such cracks now the way Tsukiko noticed a bent blade of grass, treasured every one of them. Chapter 14. The Academy's mid-year survival unit was, by long tradition, the part of the curriculum most students dreaded and most instructors privately enjoyed, a 2-day exercise in the forested training grounds south of the village meant to test the students' ability to track, evade, and endure with minimal supervision. Iruka had run it 3 years running and had never once seen a class approach it the way Naruto's did that spring, half of them treating it as an inconvenience to be survived, and one small, blonde corner of the classroom treating it as though someone had finally handed him a gift he had been waiting his whole life to open. The exercise was simple in design. Students were paired off and given a single scent marker, a strip of cloth soaked in a mild, harmless oil, hidden somewhere within the training ground's boundaries. Whichever pair located their marker first, without being spotted by the instructor teams monitoring from the tree cover, earned full marks. Most pairs blundered through the underbrush loudly enough to be caught within the first 20 minutes. Naruto, paired by chance with a quiet, unenthusiastic boy named Shikamaru Nara who seemed more interested in finding a comfortable spot to nap than in actually completing the exercise, surprised everyone, including himself a little, by taking immediate and total control of the search. You don't have to do anything, he told Shikamaru cheerfully, already crouched at the base of a tree studying a faint disturbance in the leaf litter that no one else in the class would have noticed at all. Just try not to step anywhere I haven't already stepped. I've got this. Shikamaru, who found most things troublesome but had a sharp enough mind to recognize genuine competence when it was standing in front of him, settled against the tree trunk and watched with growing, reluctant interest as Naruto worked his way through the forest with a quiet, methodical patience utterly unlike the loud, careless boy who usually sat 2 rows behind him in class. He noted, without commenting on it yet, the particular stillness Naruto fell into before each decision, the way he seemed to read the ground the way other students read a scroll. They found their marker in 11 minutes, a class record by a wide margin, and had slipped back to the checkpoint entirely unseen by their instructor team, a feat that made even Irika's carefully neutral teaching expressions slip for a moment into open surprise. How'd you do that? Shikamaru asked afterward, more curious than he usually bothered to sound about anything. That wasn't luck. You knew exactly where to look every single time. Naruto hesitated, unused to being asked genuine questions about himself by classmates who usually either ignored him or provoked him, and settled, in the end, for a version of the truth simple enough to be safe. I like tracking stuff. Animals, mostly. Guess it just makes sense to me in a way other stuff doesn't. Troublesome, Shikamaru said, though there was no real complaint in it, only the particular Nara flavor of grudging respect that rarely announced itself as respect at all. You should have been doing this the whole year instead of pulling pranks on Irika-sensei. You're actually good at something real. It lodged somewhere in Naruto's chest and stayed there for the rest of the day, small and warm, the kind of offhand compliment that most children forgot within the hour and that Naruto turned over and over on his walk home instead, cataloging it alongside the woman who ruffled his hair and the classmate who had called his tracking cool, building, one small unremarkable moment at a time, a private ledger of proof that he was not. In fact, the burden the rest of the village had always quietly told him he was. You collect these moments like a magpie collects bright things, Kurama observed that night, not unkindly, as Naruto lay in bed replaying the day for what was at least the 4th time. There is no shame in it. A person starved of something for 7 years is entitled to notice, carefully, when it finally begins arriving. I just don't want to get used to it, and then have it stop, Naruto admitted quietly, into the dark. That'd be worse than never having it at all. Then do not get used to it, Kurama said, with the blunt, practical wisdom of something that had lived far too long to bother softening truths for comfort's sake. Be grateful for each moment as it comes, and build something solid enough underneath yourself that you do not need any single one of them to keep standing. That, brat, is the only cure for the fear you are describing. Chapter 15. Danzo's operative approached the problem the way Danzo approached every problem, patiently, indirectly, and with a plausible excuse constructed well in advance for every possible failure. The man had watched the boy for weeks now, cataloging the pattern of his early morning training runs, the particular stretch of tree line he favored, the hour at which he reliably crossed the narrow footbridge over the drainage canal on his way back into the village proper. It was there, on a foggy morning with visibility poor enough to explain away almost anything, that the operative arranged what would appear, to any casual witness, to be nothing more than an unfortunate accident, a section of the footbridge's railing, quietly weakened days in advance, time to give way just as the boy crossed it. It was not meant to seriously harm him. Danzo had been explicit on that point. It was meant only to observe, in a moment of genuine, unstaged danger, exactly what instinctive response the boy's new ability produced when he had no time to consciously choose one. The railing gave way exactly on schedule. Naruto pitched sideways over the canal's edge with a startled shout, and for one suspended, gray-lit second, everything about the morning seemed to slow. He did not fall. Or rather, he fell, but not into the water. Something in him, faster than thought, faster than the fear that should by every rational measure have frozen him, sent his hand snapping out, and closing hard around the one remaining section of railing, and in the same instant his feet found impossible purchase against the bridge's slick support beam, holding him steady at an angle that should not have been physically sustainable for a 7-year-old's frame. Tsukiko, invisible and instantly alert, was there in the same heartbeat, teeth closing gently but firmly around his sleeve, adding just enough counterweight to swing him back up onto solid planking. Naruto lay sprawled on the bridge for a long moment afterward, heart pounding, staring up at gray morning sky and trying to understand what had just happened to his own body. That wasn't just balance, he said aloud, once he trusted his voice again, more to himself than to anyone. I've never been able to do that. That was, actually impossible. No, Kurama said, and there was something careful in the fox's voice now, an alertness that had not been there a moment before. That was not impossible. That was trained instinct, moving faster than your conscious thought could interfere with it. Someone taught your body to expect a fall and survive it before your mind had time to panic. A pause, heavier than the last. And bridges as sound as that one do not simply give way on their own, boy. Not in a village this well maintained. Naruto sat up slowly, looking back at the broken railing with new and unwelcome suspicion, the easy warmth of the morning suddenly gone cold around the edges. You think somebody did this on purpose? I think it would be very convenient timing for an accident, Kurama said, occurring at the exact hour and location you cross every single day, to a railing that failed in precisely the manner most likely to test how you react to sudden danger rather than to actually harm you. The old fox's voice sharpened, low and grave. Someone is testing you, brat. Carefully, and from a distance, in a way designed to look entirely accidental if anyone ever asks. That takes patience, and resources, and a very particular kind of mind. Naruto thought, uneasily, of a masked figure he had never once actually seen, only felt, on certain nights, as a faint prickling awareness at the edge of his senses that he had always dismissed as nerves or imagination. He thought of it differently now, sitting on a broken bridge in the gray morning fog, and for the first time since the clearing, since the wolf, since the bough that formed like moonlight between his hands, he understood that being chosen by something powerful did not simply mean being protected from the world. It meant, sometimes, becoming exactly the kind of thing the world's more patient and dangerous people learn to want for themselves. He walked the rest of the way to the academy in unfamiliar silence, replaying the fall over and over, trying to separate the parts of the memory that felt like his own body and the parts that felt, unsettlingly, like something else moving through him. Tsukiko stayed close at his heel the whole way, more watchful than usual, her ears swiveling at every unfamiliar sound, and Naruto found himself, for the first time since the clearing, genuinely grateful for how visibly on guard she was. It was one thing to know, in the abstract, that a goddess of the hunt had chosen him. It was another thing entirely to sit on a broken railing with wet sandals and understand, with total clarity, that somewhere out there, someone had gone to real trouble to find out exactly what that choosing meant. Chapter 16. Iruka found the broken railing before Naruto had even reached the academy that morning, having been quietly instructed weeks earlier to note anything unusual along the boy's known routes, and the report reached Hiruzen's desk within the hour, stamped with an urgency that made the old man set down his pipe without lighting it. He summoned Naruto that same afternoon, not to his formal office with its rows of watching portraits, but to a quiet private garden behind the residence, where an old man and a small boy could talk without an audience, and without the particular weight that came from sitting on opposite sides of a desk built for delivering official business. I understand your morning was eventful, Hiruzen said, settling onto a stone bench with the careful deliberateness of a man whose knees had opinions about long days, and gestured for Naruto to sit beside him. Iruka tells me the bridge railing gave way rather suspiciously. Naruto, who had spent the whole school day turning the morning over uneasily in his mind, hesitated only a moment before deciding that Hiruzen, of everyone in the village, had never once given him reason to lie. Yeah. I didn't fall in though. I don't know how. I just kind of caught myself, way better than I should have been able to. I know, Hiruzen said gently, and something in his old, tired eyes carried a weight Naruto had not seen there before, careful and a little sad. I have known, for some weeks now, that something remarkable has begun happening to you, Naruto. I have been waiting for the right moment to speak with you properly about it, and I think, given this morning, that moment has arrived rather sooner than I would have chosen. He told him, slowly and with more care than Naruto had ever been given by an adult explaining anything, about the old scroll he had found in the restricted archive. About a huntress spirit who occasionally chose a mortal child across long centuries, and the signs by which such a chosen one might be recognized, an uncanny stillness in wild places, a rapport with animals that bordered on the impossible, a mark shaped like a crescent moon cradling an arrow. Naruto sat very still through all of it, one hand instinctively pressed over the mark on his own wrist, hardly breathing, astonished to hear a stranger's ancient words describe, with almost uncanny precision, something he had believed only he and a fox behind his ribs knew anything about. "You knew," he said finally, quiet with something that was not quite betrayal, more a kind of stunned relief. "This whole time you knew, and you didn't say anything? I did not want to frighten you before you had a chance to trust what was happening to you on your own terms," Hiruzen said, and the honesty in it seemed to settle something anxious in Naruto's chest. "I have made a great many mistakes where your well-being is concerned, Naruto. I did not want carelessness with this to be one more." He was quiet a moment, watching a pair of sparrows argue over a low branch nearby. "But this morning changes matters. If someone within this village is testing you, probing you, in ways designed to be deniable, then I can no longer afford the luxury of moving slowly, for your safety's sake." "Who would even want to do that?" Naruto asked, though some small, uneasy part of him thought he already knew the shape of the answer, even without a name to put to it. Hiruzen's expression, for just a moment, went hard and old in a way that made him look every one of his many difficult years. "There are those in this village," he said carefully, "who have always believed that anything remarkable ought to be owned, rather than simply protected. I intend to make certain, as best I am able, that you never become such a person's possession. But I will need your help to do it, and your patience, and above all your trust, even when I cannot yet explain everything I am doing on your behalf." Naruto looked at the old man beside him, weighing, in the careful way he had learned to weigh most things now, whether this was another promise destined to dissolve the moment it became inconvenient. Something in Hiruzen's tired, steady eyes convinced him otherwise. "Okay," he said finally. "I trust you, old man. Just don't leave me in the dark again, okay? Even if it's scary. I'd rather know." Hiruzen's face softened into something that might, on another day, have been mistaken for simple grandfatherly warmth, though beneath it ran a current of grim, quiet resolve. "Agreed," he said. "From this day forward, Naruto, you will know." Chapter 17. Hiruzen assigned a rotating, discreet A and B watch to Naruto's routes that same week, careful and unobtrusive enough that the boy himself rarely noticed it, and careful enough, too, that it left no obvious trail for Danzo's operatives to report back as anything more than ordinary village security. It was not a permanent solution, and Hiruzen knew it. But it bought time, and time, in his long experience, was very often the only thing worth buying. For Naruto, the days that followed took on a strange, layered quality, the ordinary rhythms of academy life continuing on the surface, while underneath, quietly, everything had shifted. He knew now, in a way he had not fully let himself know before, that eyes he could not see were watching him for reasons that were not kind. It should have frightened him more than it did. Instead, oddly, it steadied something in him, the way naming a fear had always, for as long as he could remember, made it slightly easier to carry than leaving it shapeless in the dark. He turned, as he often did now, to the quiet discipline of practice, finding in the repetition of drills a kind of calm that classroom lessons had never once offered him. Tsukiko drove him harder that week than she ever had before, as though she too understood, in whatever silent animal way she understood things, that the stakes of his training had shifted, and Kurama's presence beside his own thoughts grew more attentive, less a passive companion now and more, in its gruff way, a genuine teacher. "Close your eyes," the fox instructed one evening, as Naruto sat cross-legged on the rooftop with the half-formed bough resting quiet in his lap. "Not to see less. To stop relying on the sense that lies to you most often. Your eyes tell you a threat is only where the light shows it to be. Your other senses know better. Naruto obeyed, and for a long while simply sat, breathing slow, letting the world resolve itself around him in textures rather than shapes, the particular whisper of wind moving differently around a solid object than around open air, the faint change in birdsong when something larger than a sparrow moved through nearby branches, the cool, mineral scent that always seemed to gather, however faintly, around any lingering trace of unfamiliar chakra. "There's something out there," he said eventually, eyes still closed, voice quiet and certain in a way that would have startled him only weeks earlier. "Not close. But watching. Has been for a while, I think." "Good," Kurama said, something like approval threading through the single syllable. "That is either your new ANBU shadow, doing precisely as instructed, or it is someone considerably less friendly, doing the opposite. Either way, you have just noticed what most shinobi 3 times your age would have missed entirely. That instinct, honed properly, will serve you longer and more faithfully than any single technique you could learn from a scroll. ****. It was, in its own small way, a turning point, though Naruto would not fully understand its size until much later. He had spent 7 years being watched by a village that saw him only as a burden, a danger, a shape to be avoided. He was beginning now, slowly, to understand what it meant to be watched by people and forces who saw him as something worth studying, worth cultivating, worth either protecting or possessing depending entirely on which side of that careful, quiet contest they had chosen to stand. He opened his eyes, found the moon riding high and clear above the rooftops, and drew the pale bow taut in his hands, not toward any target, simply to feel, once more, the steady, grounding weight of a gift no one could take from him even if they eventually managed to take everything else. "I'm not gonna let anybody use me," he said quietly, to the moon, to Tsukiko, to the ancient patient fox coiled behind his ribs, to a goddess he still was not entirely certain could hear him at all. "Not the old man with the bandage, not anybody. I decide what I do with this. Nobody else." Far above, though he could not know it, his words were heard exactly as clearly as he hoped they might be, and were met, in whatever quiet way gods approve of mortal resolve, with something close to satisfaction. The ANBU watch, for its part, noted the small ritual without understanding its full significance, only that the boy they were assigned to protect had begun, in recent weeks, to spend his evenings in a stillness that seemed less like a child's habit and more like the deliberate discipline of someone training for something the watcher could not name. They reported it, dutifully, in the flat clinical language such reports required, and Hiruzen, reading it later that week by lamplight, found himself smiling faintly despite the weight of everything else pressing on him. It was, he thought, a rare and welcome thing, to read a report about that particular boy and find nothing in it to worry over at all. Chapter 18. Renson was not a patient man by nature, but he had learned, across 2 decades of trading in things other people were too frightened or too reverent to touch, that impatience was the fastest way to end up dead in a forest that was not supposed to exist on any official map. The report from his 3 surviving men had been maddeningly incomplete. Something had driven them off the stag before the second antler could be harvested, something that moved like a child but fought like a trained hunter, accompanied by a wolf that appeared and vanished as though it were made of moonlight and bad memory, and, at the very end, a shape none of them could properly describe even after 3 separate retellings. Enormous and antlered and gone again before their eyes could fully process what they had seen. He had dismissed most of it, at first, as superstitious exaggeration born of fear and bad light. But the buyer he answered to, a collector of considerable wealth and considerably less patience, had wanted results from that particular grove for months, convinced, on the strength of very old and very expensive documents, that it held relics far more valuable than antlers or pelts. A boy who could summon a wolf and stand between poachers and the goddess's own forest was not, Renson decided, something to simply write off as a bad night's luck. He sent for a tracker he trusted more than most of his usual hired blades, a quiet, competent rogue shinobi named Isamu who had once served a minor lord's private guard before deciding that freelance work paid better and asked fewer questions. Isamu's instructions were simple: identify the boy, confirm what he was and what protected him, and report back without engaging directly. Renson had learned, the hard way, more than once, that engaging directly with anything wearing a goddess's mark rarely ended profitably. "You want me to just watch a kid," Isamu said flatly, unimpressed, when the assignment was laid out for him in Renson's dim backroom office above a shuttered warehouse. I want you to watch a very specific kid, in a village most sensible people avoid working inside of, without getting caught by that village's shinobi, Renson corrected, sliding a modest but respectable sum across the table. If half of what my men described is true, there is a fortune waiting for whoever properly understands what that boy carries. I intend to be the one who understands it first. Isamu took the payment, mostly because the money was good and partly because he was, in his own quiet way, curious what could possibly rattle 3 grown men badly enough to send them fleeing a forest empty-handed. He slipped into Konoha 2 days later under the unremarkable cover of a traveling merchant's hired guard, and spent the following week doing exactly what he was paid to do, watching, patient and unseen, learning the small daily patterns of a boy who had no idea, yet, that he had become someone worth tracking. He was good at his work. Good enough that Danzo's own operative, still maintaining separate and entirely unrelated surveillance on the same boy for entirely different reasons, nearly crossed paths with him twice without either man realizing the other existed. 2 very different hunters converging, from very different directions, on the same small and increasingly valuable target. Neither of them noticed, at first, the third set of eyes that had already begun watching them both, a silver-gray shape moving low and silent through rooftop shadow at dusk, ears pricked toward every unfamiliar scent that lingered too long near the boy she had sworn, in whatever wordless way spirit wolves swore things, to guard with everything in her. Tsukiko did not yet understand the full shape of either threat, only that both carried the particular careful patience of predators who had decided, for now, to watch rather than strike, and that patience, in her long and instinctive understanding of the world, was very often more dangerous than any open attack could ever be. She began, without any instruction from Naruto at all, widening her own nightly rounds, tracing the rooftops and alleys nearest his usual paths with a new and deliberate thoroughness, cataloging every unfamiliar scent the way her mistress had once taught mortal huntresses to catalog the movements of dangerous game. She could not warn him in words. She did not need to. Naruto had learned, over the months of their bond, to read her stillness as clearly as any spoken sentence, and something in the set of her shoulders those particular evenings told him, plainly enough, that the quiet around him had grown considerably more crowded than it used to be. Chapter 19. Tsukiko brought the wrongness to Naruto's attention on a warm evening nearly a week later, not with the sharp, urgent alarm of the poacher's clearing, but with a slower, more deliberate stillness, the particular quality of caution an animal reserves for a predator patient enough to be genuinely dangerous. Somebody's watching us again, Naruto murmured, low, crouched behind a stack of crates in the alley behind the market where he and Tsukiko had taken to cutting through most evenings. Not the old man's people. This feels different. It is different, Kurama confirmed, quiet and focused, the tone he reserved for matters he considered genuinely worth his full attention. The A and B your Hokage assigned carry a particular signature, familiar by now, almost comfortable in its regularity. This is not that. This is careful, and skilled, and unfamiliar, and it has been circling closer for 3 days rather than simply observing from a fixed distance. Naruto's pulse quickened, not with the raw panic of the poacher's clearing but with something steadier, sharper, the particular calm Tsukiko's months of drilling had slowly built into him. He did not run. Running, she had taught him without a single word, only told a patient hunter exactly where you intended to go. Instead, he did what she had trained into him on a dozen frustrating mornings. He slowed his breathing, let his eyes soften rather than dart, and allowed the details of the alley to arrange themselves around him the way details had learned to arrange themselves for him lately, patient and precise. A shadow, cast at an angle none of the surrounding rooftops fully explained. A stillness in the pigeons roosting above the tea shop that had nothing to do with the hour. Someone was there, positioned with real professional skill, and was very good at not being seen by anyone who was not, themselves, unusually good at seeing. He did not confront it. He was not foolish enough, even at 8 years old, to believe he could win a direct contest against a trained adult shinobi in open ground. Instead, quietly, he did something he had never attempted before, letting instinct rather than conscious plan guide his hands as he crouched low behind the crates, palms pressed briefly to the alley's packed earth, and reached, the way Tsukiko sometimes seemed to reach without moving at all, toward the small, ordinary creatures that shared every corner of the city with people too busy to notice them. The pigeons above the tea shop scattered all at once, loud and sudden, directly toward the watcher's position, forcing a flicker of movement, brief and involuntary, as the figure shifted to avoid the sudden burst of wings. It was barely anything. A half-second's disturbance in an otherwise flawless stillness. But it was enough for Naruto, watching exactly where Tsukiko's steady gaze had already fixed, to catch the outline of a man's shoulder against the darker shadow of a chimney stack, gone again almost before his eyes registered it. He did not chase. He filed the shape away instead, the way Tsukiko had taught him to file away every detail of a trail, and slipped quietly back the way he had come, hard hammering now with something that was not quite fear and not quite excitement, but a strange, sharp mixture of both. "There's definitely somebody following us," he told Kurama once he was safely home, door bolted, curtains drawn, Tsukiko pacing a restless, watchful circuit of the room. "Not the AMBU guys. Somebody new." "Then we are no longer the only ones who have noticed your value, brat," Kurama said grimly. "The old man's people watch to protect you. This one watches for other reasons entirely, and I would wager whatever remains of my patience that he does not work alone in this. Someone sent him, and someone paying for information of this kind rarely intends to use it kindly. ****. Naruto sat with that a long while, the earlier thrill of outmaneuvering a trained shinobi with nothing more than a flock of startled pigeons giving way, slowly, to a colder and more sober understanding. He was not simply a boy learning to hunt anymore. Somewhere out there, in the dark beyond his own small, careful world, he had already become something worth hunting in turn. He did not sleep well that night, and Tsukiko, sensing it, abandoned her usual spot at the foot of the bed to curl instead against his chest, a warm, solid weight he could press his hand into whenever the quiet grew too loud with imagined footsteps. It was a strange thing, he thought, lying awake in the dark, to have spent 7 years wishing desperately for someone to notice him, only to discover, now that people finally had, that not all forms of being noticed were things a person ought to wish for. He understood, for the first time with real clarity, why Artemis had chosen to teach him restraint and patience before she had ever let him touch a fully formed weapon. A hunter who could not tell the difference between being seen and being hunted was not a hunter at all. He was simply prey who had not yet realized it. Chapter 20. Isamu reported the pigeon incident to Renson 2 days later with the particular flat, unhappy honesty of a professional forced to admit that a target far younger than himself had noticed his presence, and countered it without ever once looking directly at him. "An 8-year-old spooked a flock of birds at exactly the right moment to break my cover," he said, arms crossed, clearly still turning the memory over with the discomfort of a man reassessing an assumption he had trusted for years. "That's not luck. He read the alley better than most trained scouts would have. And there's a wolf with him. Half the time I can't even confirm it's really there, but the boy reacts to it like it's solid." Renson absorbed this in silence, weighing it against everything his men had already told him, and felt, for the first time since taking on the job, a genuine flicker of unease beneath his usual businesslike calculation. He had built his career on relics and rarities that other people were too frightened to touch, and he had learned, across those years, to trust the particular quality of fear his own hired hands displayed when something exceeded their expectations. 3 grown men fleeing an unarmed child was one kind of unsettling. A trained tracker admitting, plainly, that the same child had outmaneuvered him without any visible technique at all, was another kind entirely. "Keep watching," Renson said finally, though with less certainty than he had carried into the conversation. "From further back. I want confirmation of what exactly protects him before we consider any further approach. If the wolf and whatever struck my men in that clearing are connected to old power tied to that grove, I'd rather understand it fully before I spend another coin, or another man, testing it carelessly." He did not yet know the name Artemis. He knew only fragments, old market rumors and half-credible documents describing a forest that predated the village built around it. Sacred ground, some collectors whispered, still answered, on rare occasion, to something that was not quite forgotten. He had assumed, as men like him usually assumed, that such stories were exaggeration dressed up to inflate the price of otherwise ordinary trophies. He was beginning, slowly and with real professional discomfort, to reconsider that assumption. Isamu, for his part, withdrew to a safer distance as instructed, but found himself, against his own better professional judgment, genuinely curious rather than simply cautious. He had tracked seasoned missing Nin through hostile territory without half the difficulty this small boy had presented him in a single evening, and some quiet, honest part of him, the part that had chosen this work in the first place, back before greed had fully hardened into habit, could not help but respect what he had witnessed, even as the rest of him understood exactly how dangerous it would be to underestimate it further. Neither man knew, watching from their careful distance, that the boy they studied had already begun, in his own small and steady way, to study them back. Naruto could not have named either of them, could not have guessed at Rensen's warehouse office or the exact sum of money changing hands over his own unknowing head. But he knew, with the same instinctive certainty that let him find a lost child's trail or a hidden marker in dense forest, that the danger had not passed simply because a flock of startled pigeons had bought him a single evening's advantage. They will regroup, Kurama told him that night, watching the shifting patterns of moonlight through the window with the patient attentiveness of something far older than the concerns of any single evening. Careful men who value their own skin rarely give up so easily on a prize this valuable. You bought time tonight, brat. Not safety. Use it well. Naruto took the warning seriously, in the quiet, methodical way he had learned to take most of Kurama's warnings, and spent the following days sharpening the habits Tsukiko had spent months instilling in him rather than letting the small victory soften his guard. He varied his routes home. He paid closer attention to the ordinary rhythms of the streets around him, learning to notice, the way Tsukiko noticed, when something in the patterns sat even slightly wrong. It was tiring, in a way that had nothing to do with physical exhaustion, to hold that kind of vigilance day after day at 8 years old, and there were nights he lay awake longer than he wanted to, missing, in some small and complicated way, the simpler ache of being merely lonely rather than being lonely and hunted both at once. But he did not stop. He had promised himself, on a rooftop under a rising moon, that he would decide what was done with the power he carried, and he intended, whatever it cost him, to keep that promise. Chapter 21. Hiruzen's own investigation, running quietly parallel to Naruto's private unease, finally produced a name a week later, delivered by an ANBU tracker who had spent days working the forest paths beyond the village wall in search of whatever had frightened 3 poachers badly enough to leave equipment behind in their flight. A discarded bindweed rope. A half-sawn antler, abandoned. And most usefully, a scrap of correspondence one of the fleeing men had dropped in his panic, water-damaged but partially legible, referencing payment terms and a name, Rensen, alongside an unfamiliar seal Hiruzen did not immediately recognize but resolved, grimly, to have identified. A black market broker, Hiruzen said, laying the fragment out on his desk for Irika and the ANBU captain to examine, his voice carrying the particular weariness of a man who had hoped, however faintly, that the poachers had been an isolated, opportunistic incident rather than the visible edge of something larger and more organized. Dealing, it would seem, in relics and materials taken from sacred or otherwise unusual ground. If Naruto's grove has drawn this kind of attention once, I have very little confidence it will not draw it again. You think this Rensen is connected to whoever's been watching him near the market? Irika asked, already anticipating the answer with a tightness in his jaw that had become familiar over the past weeks. I think it would be a remarkable coincidence if he were not, Hiruzen said. A boy suddenly displaying an uncanny, unexplained connection to a forest a black market broker has recently taken a costly interest in. I do not believe in coincidences of that particular size. He was quiet a moment, turning the water-stained fragment over in weathered hands. And that is, I confess, the less troubling of the 2 problems currently converging on that child. Danzo's continued interest concerns me a great deal more, given how much more resource and patience he commands than a single greedy broker ever could. He said it plainly, in front of Irika and the ANBU captain both, a small but deliberate departure from his usual careful discretion where Danzo's name was concerned, and both of them understood, without needing it explained further, exactly how seriously their Hokage had come to regard the matter. "What do we do?" Iruka asked. "For now, we widen the watch, quietly, and we begin working to identify Rensen's network before it grows bold enough to attempt something more direct than poaching," Hiruzen said. "And we continue, above all else, to let the boy live as ordinary a life as circumstances allow. He has spent 7 years surviving under the weight of the village's suspicion. I will not have him spend the years ahead of him living instead under the weight of being hunted, if there is any way at all to prevent it." He dismissed the room not long after, and sat alone for a long while in the quiet of his office, turning the whole tangled situation over with the particular grim patience of a man who had governed through 3 wars and understood, better than most, how quickly a single overlooked thread could unravel into something far larger. He thought of Naruto's face, the last time they had spoken in the garden, still so young beneath the new steadiness that had begun settling into him. He thought, too, of a goddess whose attention he could not summon or consult, whose protection, however real, could not entirely substitute for the ordinary, mortal vigilance a village owed one of its own children. He picked up his pipe at last, lit it, and allowed himself, for one brief moment, the small comfort of resolve. Whatever converged on the boy in the months ahead, broker or root operative or something older and stranger still hiding behind either of them, Hiruzen intended to make certain Naruto Uzumaki did not have to face it as alone as he had faced everything else in his short, difficult life. He sent, before the night was through, a carefully worded inquiry to a trusted contact in the land of rivers, where a broker of Rensen's particular reputation would most likely maintain his operating base, and settled in for what he suspected would be a long, patient unraveling rather than any quick resolution. Villages that traded in secrecy did not give up their secrets easily, and a man wealthy enough to hire trained trackers for reconnaissance alone was not a man who would be frightened off by a single failed poaching expedition. Hiruzen had learned, across a long and difficult life, that the patient enemies were always the ones worth taking most seriously, and he intended, this time, to be more patient still. Chapter 22. Life did, against all reasonable expectation, go on ordinarily around the edges of everything converging on him, and Naruto found, somewhat to his own surprise, that he was grateful for the ordinariness rather than resentful of it. The Academy's final stretch before the year's end approached with its usual mixture of dread and anticipation among the students, and Naruto discovered, over those weeks, that his standing among his classmates had shifted in small, cumulative ways he had not fully tracked until Shikamaru pointed it out to him one lazy afternoon, both of them sprawled in the shade of a tree during a break between lessons. "People don't look at you the same way anymore," Shikamaru said, watching clouds drift overhead with his usual air of a boy conserving energy for anything less restful than lying still. "Kiba thinks you're interesting instead of annoying now. Even Hinata stopped flinching every time you talked too loud near her." "Hinata flinches at everything," Naruto pointed out, not unkindly, though he could not entirely suppress the small, pleased warmth the observation stirred in him regardless. "Fair," Shikamaru allowed, "but she watches you with the animals during break now instead of looking away. That cat that follows you around the training yard, the mean one that scratched Kiba's dog last month, it lets you pick it up like it's nothing. People notice stuff like that eventually, even if they don't say anything about it out loud." It was true, Naruto realized, turning the observation over with genuine surprise, that animals had become something of a quiet fixture around him at the academy without his fully noticing the pattern forming. Stray cats. The occasional sparrow that landed, briefly and inexplicably, on his shoulder during outdoor lessons. Even the Inuzuka dogs, notoriously particular about strangers, had begun greeting him with the loose, easy tail wagging usually reserved for their own handlers' close friends. He had assumed, when he thought about it at all, that it was simply Tsukiko's lingering influence rubbing off on the animals nearby. Kurama, when he asked, offered a slightly more layered explanation. "It is not merely her influence," the fox said, sounding faintly amused. "Animals sense intention more honestly than people do. They do not care what the village whispers about you, or what mark you carry, or which powerful men have taken a dangerous interest in you. They care only whether the creature in front of them means harm or means kindness, and you, brat, radiate the latter so plainly that even the most suspicious alley cat cannot help but notice it. It was, Naruto thought, turning the idea over as he walked home that evening, one of the stranger and more welcome truths he had learned since the clearing, that the same quality the village had spent years teaching him to hide, his eagerness to be gentle with things smaller and more vulnerable than himself, had turned out, in the end, to be exactly the thing a goddess of the hunt valued most, and exactly the thing that was slowly, unhurriedly, changing how his classmates saw him too. He found Kiba waiting for him near the academy gate the next morning, arms crossed, looking faintly awkward in the way boys that age often looked when working up to say something they had clearly rehearsed. My mom says the Inuzuka clan doesn't usually invite outsiders to train with our dogs, Kiba said, a little too fast, a little too pointedly casual. But she also said if a kid can get Akamaru's whole litter to settle down just by sitting near them, that kid's probably worth making an exception for. So, you wanna come by sometime? See how we train? Naruto stood there a moment, stunned into rare silence by an invitation so plainly, uncomplicatedly kind that he almost did not trust it. Then he grinned, wide and real in the way that had once been mostly performance, and was, more and more these days, simply true. Yeah, he said. Yeah, I'd really like that. He walked the rest of the way home that afternoon lighter than he had felt and longer than he could easily remember, and even Kurama, usually so sparing with anything resembling open sentiment, offered nothing but a low, contented rumble when Naruto recounted the whole exchange aloud that evening, turning it over from every angle the way he once might have turned over a prank gone especially well. It was such a small thing, an invitation to train with a clanmate's dogs, and yet it sat in his chest like something far larger than its size suggested, one more brick in a foundation he had never imagined, a year ago, that he would ever be lucky enough to lay. Chapter 23. The confrontation, when it finally came, arrived not in the depths of the sacred grove but far closer to home, on an ordinary evening that gave no warning at all of how badly it was about to go wrong for the people hunting him. Isamu had grown impatient waiting on Rensen's cautious instructions, convinced, after 2 more weeks of careful observation, that he understood the shape of the threat well enough to risk a closer approach, not an attack, only a controlled test, a single engineered moment of danger stage to draw out whatever protection the boy carried and finally put a clear, reportable shape to it. He chose a quiet stretch of the drainage canal path at dusk, far enough from the market's usual foot traffic to avoid witnesses, and arranged, with the same patient precision Danzo's own operative had used weeks earlier, for a seemingly ordinary stranger, in truth a hired accomplice, to stage a sudden, aggressive confrontation directly in Naruto's path. It went wrong for Isamu almost immediately. Tsukiko caught the accomplice's scent a full minute before he ever stepped into view, wrongness threaded through it in a way she had learned, over months at Naruto's side, to recognize instantly, and by the time the man lunged forward with a blade meant only to look threatening rather than actually connect, Naruto was already moving, low and fast. The pale bow snapping into solid form in his hands with none of the hesitation that had marked his very first fight in the poacher's clearing months. Earlier, he did not panic. He did not freeze. He put an arrow through the man's shoulder with a precision that made even Isamu, watching from concealment with growing alarm, forget for a moment that his instructions had been strictly to observe. Enough, Isamu said, stepping out of hiding almost against his own better judgment, hands raised in a gesture meant to defuse rather than escalate. I'm calling this off. Nobody needs to get hurt worse than that. Naruto's bow did not waver, arrow already knocked and aimed steady at the new arrival, Tsukiko a low, snarling shape at his side, fur bristling silver in the fading light. You've been watching me for weeks, he said, voice tight but level, the words landing with a certainty that startled Isamu more than the arrow did. I know it was you. Following me. Setting this up. You're sharper than you have any right to be at your age, Isamu said, with the particular rueful honesty of a professional who has simply run out of useful lies to offer. I was hired to observe. That's all. I never meant to actually hurt you, kid, whatever that idiot with the knife decided to improvise on his own. Who hired you? Isamu hesitated, weighing loyalty against the mounting, uncomfortable sense that he had badly misjudged exactly how dangerous this particular assignment truly was, and in the end, professional pride lost cleanly to simple self-preservation. A broker. Goes by Renson. Deals in relics, mostly, and whatever your grove is, he's decided it's worth a fortune, and you along with it. He took a slow step back, hands still raised, retreating rather than pressing his advantage even slightly. For what it's worth, kid, I'd tell him to find a different prize. Nothing I've seen tonight is worth the trouble of chasing it further. He vanished into the dusk a moment later, dragging his wounded accomplice with him, and did not return. Naruto stood alone in the fading light for a long moment afterward, bow slowly dissolving from his shaking hands. Tsukiko pressed hard and warm against his side, and allowed himself, finally, to feel the full weight of how close the evening had come to going very differently. You held your ground, Kurama said quietly, something like genuine pride threading through the words. Against a trained adult, with nothing but instinct and a wolf and a bow made of moonlight, and you held your ground without losing your composure. That is no small thing, brat. That is the making of exactly what your goddess chose you to become. Naruto sat there a long while longer, letting the adrenaline finally drain out of him in the cool evening air, Tsukiko's steady breathing against his side the only sound besides the distant, ordinary murmur of the village going on about its evening as though nothing at all had happened along its quiet canal path. He thought of Isamu's retreating back, of the strange, tired honesty in the man's voice at the end, as though some part of him had genuinely meant the warning he left behind. He thought, too, of the name Renson, turning it over the way Tsukiko had taught him to turn over any new and unfamiliar trail, filing it carefully away alongside everything else he had learned to carry since the night of the rain. He did not know yet how large a thread that single name would eventually prove to be. He only knew, walking home at last beneath a sky gone fully dark, that he had faced something dangerous and real, and had not been the one left broken by it. Chapter 24. Hiruzen's ANBU reached the canal path minutes after Isamu's retreat, drawn by a disturbance one of the rotating watchers had caught at the very edge of their patrol, and found Naruto sitting on the bank with Tsukiko's head heavy in his lap, shaken but entirely unharmed, and a name waiting for them that finally gave the whole investigation a solid thread to pull. Renson, Hiruzen repeated later that evening, once Naruto had been safely walked home and the report had made its way, in full, back to the Hokage's desk. Confirmed, at last, and by the boy himself rather than by scraps of water-damaged correspondence. He allowed himself a rare, grim satisfaction at the small victory, tempered immediately by the larger, more uncomfortable truth underneath it. Which means our broker has grown bold enough to send a train tracker directly into the village to test my Hokage's own ward. That is no longer the behavior of a man who considers this merely a profitable curiosity. The investigation that followed moved with renewed urgency, quiet inquiries sent out through trusted contacts in neighboring territories, careful pressure applied through channels Renson's network had not yet learned to guard against. It would take longer than a single evening to fully unravel, Hiruzen knew, but for the first time since the poacher's clearing, the village held a genuine, actionable thread, and that, after weeks of careful, worried waiting, felt like no small thing at all. For Naruto, the days that followed carried a strange, settled quality, equal parts exhaustion and quiet pride. Irika fussed over him more than usual, in the careful, undemonstrative way that had become his particular version of affection. Kiba's invitation to train with the Inuzuka dogs arrived again, gently insistent, and this time Naruto accepted properly, spending an entire golden afternoon in the clan's training grounds learning, laughing, feeling for the first time like an ordinary boy with ordinary friends rather than a secret carefully guarded from a village that had spent years failing to see him at all. That night, exhausted in the particular deep, satisfied way that comes after a genuinely good day, he fell asleep almost before his head found the pillow, and dreamed, for the first time since the clearing, of silver eyes and moonlight. "You have done well," Artemis said, in the dream or beyond it, standing once more beneath antlers pale as bone, the ancient stone at her back humming faintly with a light Naruto could feel more than see. You held your ground against a trained hand without losing yourself to fear or cruelty. You have begun building around yourself exactly the kind of family a hunter needs, freely given rather than demanded, and you have refused, every single time it has been tested, to let power become an excuse for carelessness. Asterisk. It's scary, though, Naruto admitted, in the easy, unguarded way dreams sometimes allowed truths to surface that daylight made harder to voice. People keep coming after me. The old man with the bandage. Now this broker guy. It doesn't feel like it's gonna stop. It will not stop, Artemis said, without softening the truth of it, though there was no unkindness in the honesty, only the same steady respect she had shown him since the very first night in the rain. Asterisk power, once noticed, is rarely left alone by those who covet it. But you are not facing it the way you once faced everything else in your life, alone, unnoticed, and unarmed. You have a wolf who would give her every breath for yours. A fox who has chosen, in his own stubborn way, to guard you as fiercely as I do. A village slowly, imperfectly, learning to actually see you. And you have me, Naruto Uzumaki, and I do not choose lightly, and I do not abandon what I have chosen. Asterisk. The dream began to fade, moonlight thinning toward morning, and her final words followed him up out of sleep like the last, lingering note of a horn call across still water. Asterisk rest now. Grow steady. The trials ahead of you will be greater than a broker's greed or one old man's ambition, and they are not yet close enough to trouble you tonight. For now, simply be exactly what you have already begun to become, a hunter who protects, in a world that is only just beginning to learn what that means. Asterisk. He woke to ordinary morning light, Tsukiko already curled warm against his side, the memory of the dream settling into him not as something urgent to chase after but as something steady to carry, the way a stone carried in a pocket grows warm from simply being held. He dressed for the academy, ate the bruised fruit the grocer had set aside for him without comment, and walked the familiar streets toward another ordinary day, unaware that far beyond the village, a broker's patience had already begun curdling into something more dangerous than mere greed, and that the name Renson, for all the trouble it had already caused, was only the first thread of a much larger and older tapestry beginning, slowly, to unravel toward him. Chapter 25. Autumn came to Konoha in slow gold, and with it came a change in Naruto that even the most casual observer could no longer mistake for ordinary growth. He was 9 now, taller by a hand's width than he had been in the rain-soaked clearing 2 years earlier, and the stillness Tsukiko had spent those years drilling into him had settled into something closer to permanent instinct than deliberate effort. He no longer had to remind himself to soften his eyes and let a room's details arrange themselves around him. He simply saw, the way other children simply breathed, and the seeing had begun, in recent weeks, to extend further than it ever had before. It happened first on a training ground far from the village walls, on a crisp morning when Irika had set the class a simple exercise in tracking a released hare through open scrubland. Naruto crouched at the trail's edge, closed his eyes the way he always did, and felt, instead of the familiar narrow thread of scent and disturbed earth he expected, something wider and stranger unfold around him, a fleeting, borrowed glimpse of the hare's own frightened path through the grass, as though for one disorienting heartbeat he had seen the world through eyes that were not his own. He opened his eyes with a gasp, and found the hare already correctly located, 20 paces further than any trail marker could have honestly told him. Interesting, Kurama said, sounding for once genuinely startled rather than merely observant. That was not tracking, brat. That was borrowing sight. I have heard old stories of huntresses who could see briefly through the eyes of the creatures under their protection, but I did not expect that gift to surface in you so young, nor so suddenly. Asterisk. Is that bad? Naruto asked, quiet, still faintly dizzy from the strange doubled sensation of it. No, Kurama said, thoughtful now rather than alarmed. It means your bond with her domain runs deeper than even I had assumed. But gifts that arrive faster than a person is ready for them can be dangerous in their own way. Go carefully with this one. Do not lean on it until you understand its limits. Irika, watching from the checkpoint with the whole class gathered to compare results, only saw a boy who had once again finished an exercise well ahead of his classmates, and said as much with the particular warm, undemonstrative pride that had become one of the steadiest fixtures of Naruto's week. That's 3 drills running now where you've beaten the rest of the class by more than double, he said, checking his notes with a faint, considering frown. I might need to start setting you separate exercises, Naruto, or the others are going to start feeling like there's no point trying. Sorry, Naruto said, not sounding especially sorry, grinning wide enough that Iruka found it impossible to summon any real reprimand behind the words. Don't apologize for being good at something, Iruka said instead, ruffling his hair the way he had taken to doing more often lately, an easy, unthinking gesture that still, every time, settled warm and startling in Naruto's chest. Just promise me you'll keep being careful about how far you push it. Whatever this new sense of yours is, I'd rather you grow into it slowly than burn yourself out trying to prove something to anyone. He told no one at the academy what had happened, filing it away instead alongside the other private, unexplainable pieces of himself he had learned to keep close. But that night, on the rooftop under a moon 2 days past full, he sat along while simply reaching, tentative and careful, toward the awareness of small creatures moving through the dark below him, a cat stalking along a fence line, an owl gliding silent over the rooftops. Each borrowed glimpse brief and disorienting and in its own strange way, wondrous. Tsukiko watched him practice with her usual patient attentiveness, occasionally nudging his hand when his concentration wavered too far, and it struck him, somewhere in the quiet hours of that practice, how far he had traveled from the boy who had once sat alone beneath a noodle stand's eave, waiting out the rain with nothing and no one. He had a wolf who loved him without condition. A fox who had become, against every reasonable expectation, something like a gruff and watchful uncle. A goddess who checked in on him, however rarely, in dreams that felt more real each time they came. Friends, now, at the academy, who greeted him by name instead of edging away. It was, he thought, more than he had ever let himself hope for, back when hoping for anything at all had felt like an indulgence he could not afford. He did not yet know that the very gift he had discovered that morning, the ability to see briefly through another creature's eyes, had also been noticed, from a careful distance, by watchers who understood its significance far better than he did himself. Nor did he know that far beyond the village, in a warehouse office above a shuttered street, Renson had finally received a message from the buyer he answered to, brief and impatient and carrying, beneath its careful formal language, the unmistakable edge of a man who had grown tired of waiting. The Grove's champion grows stronger by the season, the message read, in a hand old and precise. * delay no further. Bring me the boy, or bring me proof of what he carries. My patience, and my payment, both have limits, and you are close to testing the far edge of mine. * Chapter 26. Renson read the message twice in the privacy of his office, and felt, for the first time in a long career built on careful, deniable transactions, something close to real fear. He had dealt with demanding buyers before. He had never dealt with one who signed his correspondence with a seal. Renson had learned, only recently and with considerable unease, to associate with rumors he had once dismissed as market exaggeration, a cult, old and secretive, that traced its lineage back to a hunter the ancient stories claimed had been struck down by a jealous goddess for daring to believe himself her equal. He had assumed, when the commissions first arrived years ago, that he was dealing with a wealthy eccentric obsessed with old legends. He understood now, reading this particular message a third time, that he had very likely been dealing all along with something considerably more dangerous than a collector's whim. He summoned Osamu that same evening, more out of a need to think aloud with someone he trusted than any real expectation of useful counsel, and laid the message out on the table between them without comment. Osamu read it, set it down, and was quiet for a long moment. You want my honest opinion? That's why I called you. Walk away from this one. Osamu's voice carried none of his usual professional detachment now, only the flat, weary honesty of a man who had seen, up close, exactly what the boy in question could already do at 8 years old, and had no illusions left about what an organized cult with real resources might attempt against him. Whatever this buyer actually is, he's not asking for a trophy anymore. He's asking you to kidnap a child under the protection of one of the 5 great villages, a child who already fought off my own approach without breaking a sweat. That's not a job. That's a death sentence with extra steps. I've never walked away from a paying commission in 20 years, Renson said, though the words carried less conviction than he intended them to. Then maybe it's time you started, Osamu said. I've tracked missing Neem through 3 different countries and never once felt what I felt watching that boy hold his ground against me. Whatever protects him isn't ordinary, Renson. And whatever's asking you to steal him away isn't ordinary either, judging by that seal. You put those 2 things in a room together, somebody's not walking out of it, and I wouldn't bet on it being the boy. Renson sat with that a long while after Isamu had gone, turning the message over in the lamplight, weighing 2 decades of careful, profitable caution against the mounting, uncomfortable sense that he had, somewhere along the way, wandered into a game far larger and far older than any he had ever played before. He was not, in the end, a man entirely without conscience, whatever his trade might have suggested about him to outsiders. He had built his reputation on relics and rarities, not on children, and the longer he stared at the buyer's precise, patient handwriting, the more clearly he understood that whoever had written it did not intend to stop asking simply because Renson himself grew reluctant to deliver. He drafted, that same night, 2 letters. One, careful and evasive, to the buyer, requesting more time and more information before proceeding further. The other, considerably more difficult to write, addressed to no one in particular yet, a private accounting of everything he knew about the cult's interest in the grove, the boy, and the old, dangerous legend the buyer's seal seemed to represent, tucked away in a drawer against the day he might finally need to hand it to someone capable of stopping what he had, however unwillingly, helped set into motion. He did not yet know that such a day would arrive far sooner than he expected, or that the choice he made in the weeks ahead would matter far more, to a great many people, than any single commission ever had before. For 3 restless nights afterward, Renson found himself doing something he had not done in a very long time, taking stock, honestly and without the practiced self-justification he usually reached for, of the shape his life had gradually taken. He had told himself, across 2 decades of trading in relics no honest merchant would touch, that he dealt in objects rather than lives, that the difference between a stolen antler and a stolen childhood was a line he had never once been asked to cross. The buyer's letter had made plain, in its cold, impatient language, exactly how thin that line had actually been all along, and how close he had already come to crossing it without ever quite admitting to himself that he was walking toward it. He thought, more than once during those sleepless nights, of the boy himself, a figure he had never met and knew only through Isamu's grudging, increasingly respectful reports, quick, disciplined, fiercely protective of a wolf that might have been his oldest friend in the world, holding his ground against the trained adult with nothing but instinct and a weapon made of moonlight. It was not, Renson found, an easy image to reconcile with the cold calculations he had spent months making about the boy's value on an open market that did not, in truth, exist for anything so precious as a living, breathing child. Chapter 27. Hiruzen's inquiry into Renson's network finally bore fruit that same week, in the form of a contact within the land of rivers who had, at considerable personal risk, managed to intercept a fragment of correspondence bearing the same precise, formal hand and the same old, unfamiliar seal that had so unsettled Renson himself. He laid the fragment out on his desk beside the earlier scrap the ANBU had recovered from the poacher's clearing, and studied the seal for a long while in silence. A stylized bow crossed with a broken spear, wrought in gold, framed by a ring of stars arranged in a pattern that tugged, faintly and uncomfortably, at some half-remembered corner of his considerable historical knowledge. "I want this identified," he told the ANBU captain standing at ease before his desk. "Every archive we hold, every scholar we can quietly consult without drawing unwanted attention. If this symbol carries any history at all, I want it in my hands before the week is finished." It was, in the end, an elderly historian attached to the Fire Temple, consulted through careful and deniable channels, who finally supplied an answer, delivered in the hushed, faintly reverent tones scholars reserved for legends they had never expected to matter outside a dusty scroll. The symbol, she explained, belonged to a cult calling itself the Fallen Bow, a secretive order tracing its origin back many centuries to a legendary hunter who had, according to the oldest surviving fragments of the myth, grown so skilled and so proud that he had dared to challenge a goddess of the hunt to a contest of skill, and had been struck down for his arrogance before the contest could ever be finished. His followers, rather than accepting the lesson the myth seemed intended to teach, had instead spent centuries nursing a bitter, patient grudge, convinced that their hunter had been murdered out of jealousy rather than justly humbled, and dedicating themselves, generation after generation, to the quiet accumulation of any relic or bloodline connected to the goddess who had struck him down, in hopes of one day reversing what they considered an ancient and unforgivable injustice. They believe, the historian said carefully, that a mortal chosen by that same goddess, if properly bound and controlled, could be used to channel enough of her power to finally restore what they lost. It has always been considered myth layered over myth, Hokage-sama. I confess I never expected to see its symbol appear in a genuine intercepted correspondence. Hiruzen sat with the full weight of that explanation for a long while after the historian had gone, the pieces of the past several months finally arranging themselves into a shape considerably larger and more dangerous than a simple black market broker's opportunism. Renson, whatever his private reservations might eventually prove to be, was very likely only a convenient, deniable intermediary. The true danger lay behind him, patient and old and driven by centuries of grievance rather than mere greed, and Hiruzen understood, with the particular cold clarity that came only rarely across a long life of difficult decisions, that the coming weeks would require a great deal more than quiet surveillance and careful patience. He summoned Irika and the ANBU captain both that same evening, and for the first time since the whole affair had begun, spoke plainly and without euphemism about the scale of what they were now facing. "We are no longer dealing with poachers, or even with a broker's greed," he told them. "We are dealing with a cult old enough and patient enough to have waited centuries for a chance like this one, and if their letters to Renson are any indication, their patience is very close to running out." He looked between them both, old eyes carrying the particular weary resolve of a man who had governed through worse and intended, whatever it cost him, to see this through as well. From this point forward, Naruto's protection is no longer a discrete, background matter. I want a genuine, layered defense in place, and I want it in place before whatever this cult intends arrives at our gates rather than after. Irika absorbed the full weight of it in silence, feeling the particular cold settle that came from realizing a child he had grown to care for deeply now stood at the center of something far older and far larger than any single village's ordinary concerns. "What do you need from me, Hokage-sama?" "For now, precisely what you have already been doing," Hiruzen said, something gentler entering his voice despite the gravity of the moment. "Continue to be, for him, the steady and ordinary presence he has come to rely on. Whatever storms gather beyond the village walls, I would like at least one part of his life to remain untouched by them for as long as we can manage it." Chapter 28. Danzo learned of the fallen bough within days of Hiruzen's own discovery, through channels of his own that answered to considerably less oversight than the Hokage's official archive requests, and found in the revelation not alarm but opportunity. A cult old enough to have waited centuries, desperate enough to risk direct action against the hidden village's ward, was, in Danzo's careful calculation, precisely the kind of external threat that might finally justify the formal, sanctioned intervention he had been quietly maneuvering toward for 2 years. He requested an audience with Hiruzen the following morning, and arrived at the Hokage's office with the particular careful diplomacy he reserved for arguments he had rehearsed thoroughly in advance. A cult with centuries of patience and a genuine claim on ancient power will not be deterred by a handful of rotating ANBU, Danzo said, once the pleasantries required between them had been dispensed with. "I propose a formal training program, structured and sanctioned, to accelerate the boy's development under proper, disciplined supervision. A weapon left half-formed is far more vulnerable than one brought fully into its potential, Hiruzen. Surely even you can see the wisdom in that, whatever your sentiment toward the boy personally." "The wisdom I see," Hiruzen said, voice carrying an edge Danzo rarely heard directed at him so plainly, "is in continuing to allow that child something resembling an ordinary childhood, for as long as circumstances permit it, rather than surrendering him to a program that would strip that childhood away in the name of efficiency." He set down his pipe, meeting Danzo's single visible eye without flinching. "I am aware, old friend, of precisely what your training programs tend to produce. I have no intention of allowing this particular child to become one more addition to that collection." "Sentiment," Danzo said, with the faint, patient disdain he reserved for arguments he considered beneath serious consideration, will not protect him from a cult willing to risk direct confrontation with a hidden village. I am offering discipline, structure, the tools to survive what is coming, rather than the comfortable illusion that kindness alone will be sufficient. He has more discipline in him already than half the shinobi under your command, Hiruzen said, earned honestly, through his own effort and the guidance of people who care whether he survives the process rather than merely whether he becomes useful at the end of it. My answer remains the same as it has been every time you have raised this particular proposal, Danzo. No. Danzo did not argue further, recognizing, with the particular patience that had served him across a long and calculating career, when further pressure would only cost him standing rather than gain him ground. He inclined his head, a gesture that carried more warning than deference, and withdrew from the office without another word on the matter, leaving Hiruzen alone with the uncomfortable certainty that the conversation had bought Naruto time rather than true safety, and that Danzo, patient as ever, would simply wait for a crisis severe enough to make his proposal appear reasonable rather than merely convenient. Hiruzen sat a long while afterward, watching the afternoon light shift slowly across his office floor, and thought, not for the first time, of how much easier his position would be if the threats converging on one small boy came from a single, simple direction rather than from every corner of the board at once, an ancient cult driven by centuries of grievance, a broker caught reluctantly between profit and conscience, and, closer to home and in some ways more troubling than either, a man within his own village who had never once, in all the years Hiruzen had known him, stopped believing that anything remarkable existed only to be used. He thought, too, of the years he and Danzo had spent as young men, trained under the same teacher, shaped by the same brutal war, and how differently that shared history had settled into each of them by the time they reached old age. He had chosen, across the decades since, to believe that the village he served was strongest when it protected its most vulnerable rather than simply arming them. Danzo had chosen, with equal conviction and equal sincerity in his own way, that sentiment was a luxury the village could never truly afford. It was, Hiruzen thought, one of the great quiet tragedies of his long life, that two men who had once fought so fiercely for the same home could arrive, by such different roads, at conclusions so fundamentally opposed to one another, and that he could never be entirely certain, on his more difficult nights, which one of them history would eventually prove more correct. Chapter 29. Naruto knew nothing of the conversation between Hiruzen and Danzo, and would not learn of it for some time yet, but he felt, in the weeks that followed, a subtle shift in the careful architecture the Hokage had built around him, more frequent visits from Iruka outside of academy hours, a slightly heavier Anbu presence he was clearly meant to notice rather than remain entirely unaware of, and one crisp evening, an invitation to the Hokage's private garden that carried a gravity different from their earlier conversation there. There is a great deal I still cannot tell you, Hiruzen said, once they were settled on the same stone bench where he had first explained the old scroll, not because I doubt your right to know it, but because some of it remains too uncertain, and too dangerous, to burden you with before it is fully confirmed. But I want you to understand that the world beyond this village has begun to take a very serious interest in what you carry, Naruto, and I need you to take your own safety at least as seriously as I take mine on your behalf. The broker guy, Naruto said, more statement than question, watching a pair of sparrows settle onto the garden's low wall. Rensen. It's about him, isn't it? Whatever he's mixed up in. In part, Hiruzen admitted, choosing his words with visible care. There are people, old and patient and driven by grievances centuries deep, who believe you might be used to reclaim something they lost long ago. I do not yet know precisely what shape their next move will take, only that it is coming, and that I intend to make certain you are as prepared for it as any child your age could reasonably be. Naruto absorbed this in the quiet, steady way that had become more and more his default over the past 2 years, turning the weight of it over without letting it topple him the way similar news once might have. Kurama already figured something like this was coming, he said eventually. He's been making me train harder lately. Guess now I know why. Good, Hiruzen said, something like relief threading through the single word. Trust that instinct in him, and in yourself. And trust, too, that you are not facing this the way you once faced everything else, alone and unsupported. You have people now who will stand between you and whatever comes, Naruto. Myself included, whatever it costs me to keep that promise. That night, on the rooftop under a thin crescent moon, Naruto sat alone while turning the conversation over, Tsukiko's steady presence a familiar warmth against his side, and found himself, for the first time since the earliest days of his training, genuinely afraid rather than simply cautious. Not for himself, exactly, though there was some of that too. Mostly for the people who had begun, slowly and carefully, to matter to him in ways he had never let himself hope for. Iruka's quiet, undemonstrative care, Kiba's easy friendship, the old grocer's bruised fruit set aside without comment, Hiruzen's tired, steady eyes carrying more weight on his behalf than any Hokage should reasonably have to carry for a single child. Fear is not weakness, Kurama said quietly, sensing the shift in him without needing to be told. It only becomes weakness if you let it make your decisions for you instead of simply informing them. You are afraid because you finally have things worth being afraid for. That is not a flaw in you, brat. That is proof of exactly how far you have come from the boy who once had nothing left to lose at all. Naruto drew the pale bow into being between his hands, feeling its familiar cool weight settle against his palms, and looked out over the sleeping village, at rooftops and lantern light and the quiet, ordinary lives of people who had no idea how close an old and patient danger had already drawn. Whatever was coming, he thought, he intended to make certain it found him ready rather than merely willing. Chapter 30. The fallen bough did not announce its arrival with anything so obvious as an attack. It arrived instead in the guise of ordinary commerce, 3 merchants and their small caravan requesting standard entry permits at the village gate on a gray, unremarkable morning, papers in perfect order, goods precisely what they claimed to be, nothing about them worth a second glance from the gate guards who processed a dozen such caravans every week. Tsukiko noticed them before Naruto did, 3 streets away, a low and unhappy stillness settling over her the moment the caravan scent first reached her on the morning breeze, sharp beneath its ordinary layers of dust and travel with something old and wrong, like incense burned too long in an enclosed space. What is it? Naruto asked, slowing on his way to the academy, following her fixed attention toward the market square where the caravan had begun setting up its modest stall. Careful, Kurama warned, before Naruto had even finished the question, his voice sharper than usual. That scent is not merely unfamiliar. It carries the particular staleness of old ritual, the kind practiced by people who have spent generations perfecting the art of appearing harmless while they wait for the right moment to stop pretending. I do not like this, brat. Not at all. Naruto did not approach the stall directly, mindful of everything Hiruzen and his own instincts had drilled into him over the preceding weeks, but he watched from a careful distance as the 3 merchants went about their business with unhurried, practiced ordinariness, and noted, with the same careful attention Tsukiko had spent 2 years teaching him, the small details that did not quite fit the picture they presented. The way their eyes moved across the crowd with too much precision for casual travelers, the particular economy of motion in how they arranged their goods, more like soldiers settling into a defensive position than merchants hoping to attract customers. He reported what he had seen to Iruka the moment he reached the academy, and Iruka, true to the new arrangement Hiruzen had put in place, related up the chain within the hour, quiet and urgent, until it reached a Hokage who received the news with far less surprise than genuine, grim confirmation. Do not approach them, Hiruzen instructed, once Naruto had been brought quietly to the office to recount the details himself. Do not give them any reason to believe you have noticed anything unusual. Continue your day precisely as you would otherwise, and let my people handle the matter of confirming what they truly are. It was, Naruto found, considerably harder than it sounded, to sit through an ordinary academy afternoon knowing that somewhere in the market square, 3 strangers who might well be part of the very cult his Hokage had warned him about were going about their calm, deliberate business only a few streets away. He managed it anyway, drawing on every scrap of the stillness Tsukiko had spent 2 years building into him, and found by the day's end, that the discipline held even under pressure it had never truly been tested against before. The ANBU's confirmation came that evening, quiet and unequivocal, beneath the caravan's mundane cargo, carefully concealed in a false-bottomed chest, lay ritual implements bearing the unmistakable stylized bow and broken spear of the fallen bow's seal, alongside notes, written in the same precise hand that had corresponded with Rensen, detailing observations of Naruto's daily routines that could only have come from careful, patient surveillance stretching back weeks. They had, Hiruzen realized, grim and unsurprised in equal measure, already been watching him for far longer than anyone in the village had known to look for them. He read through the notes twice. With a mounting unease, he was careful not to show the ANBU captain waiting on his response, and found within them a level of detail that unsettled him more than the ritual implements themselves. The precise hour Naruto left for the academy each morning, the specific stretch of tree line he favored for his early practice, even a passing clinical observation of the wolf that walked invisibly at his side, described not as a curiosity but as a confirmed and expected feature of the huntress's chosen. Whoever had compiled these notes had studied the old legends thoroughly enough to know exactly what signs to look for, and had found every single one of them exactly where the ancient texts promised they would be. They know him better than most of his own classmates do, Hiruzen said quietly, more to himself than to the room, setting the notes aside with the careful, controlled precision of a man determined not to let his own alarm show too plainly. That tells me this has never truly been about capturing an unknown quantity. They have known precisely what he is for a very long time, and have simply been waiting, with considerably more patience than I would like, for the right moment to act on it. Chapter 31. Hiruzen ordered the 3 merchants detained that same night, moving with a swiftness that surprised even his own ANBU captain, unwilling to allow the fallen Bao another day's advantage now that their presence had been confirmed beyond doubt. The operation went smoothly enough on its surface, 3 ordinary-seeming travelers taken quietly into custody without incident or resistance, and Hiruzen allowed himself, for the length of a single evening, the cautious relief of a threat contained before it could fully unfold. The relief did not survive the interrogation. The detained merchants, it became swiftly and unsettlingly clear, knew almost nothing of genuine value. They had been sent, they claimed, and the truth of their confusion seemed painfully genuine, only to observe and report, low-ranking members of a far larger organization who had never once met the figure who directed their orders and would not have recognized him if they had. They spoke of the fallen Bao's true leadership only in reverent, fearful fragments. A man they called simply the Fletcher, who had led the cult for longer than any of them had been alive, whose true face none of them had ever seen beneath the ceremonial mask he wore even among his own most trusted followers. He does not send his true hand for observation, one of the merchants admitted, under careful and increasingly worried questioning. Observation is for the expendable. If he has decided the boy is truly ready to be taken, the Fletcher will not send caravans next time. He will come himself, or send those close enough to him that failure is not an option they are permitted to consider. Hiruzen received this news with the particular cold clarity that came, across a long life, only in moments of genuine and confirmed danger. 3 merchants detained meant, in the Fletcher's calculation, only that an expendable layer of his organization had been spent and lost. It did not mean the threat had passed. If anything, it meant the true confrontation, whatever shape it eventually took, had drawn considerably closer, no longer a matter of patient, distant observation but of a leader who now understood, beyond doubt, that his interest in the boy had been noticed. He summoned every resource he could reasonably justify without drawing unwanted attention from the village council. Additional ANBU rotated onto Naruto's protection detail, quiet coordination with trusted allies in neighboring territories to watch for any sign of the fallen Bao's true leadership moving through the region, and, in the privacy of his own conscience, a decision he had been avoiding for weeks finally made plain to himself. Naruto could no longer be shielded from the full truth of what pursued him, however much Hiruzen wished otherwise. A threat this patient and this dangerous required a boy who understood, completely and without illusion, exactly what he was up against. He called Naruto to his office the following morning, and this time, there was no careful softening of the truth, no measured pace designed to protect a child's remaining innocence. He explained, plainly and completely, the Fletcher's mask, the merchant's fearful reverence, the cold, mounting certainty that whatever came next would not arrive disguised as ordinary commerce. Naruto listened in a silence that had, over the preceding weeks, grown considerably steadier than fearful, and when Hiruzen finally finished, he found, to his own quiet surprise, that the boy's response carried none of the panic he had half-braced himself to manage. "Okay," Naruto said, simple and level, one hand resting unconsciously over the mark on his wrist. "Then I guess I'd better be ready when he does." Hiruzen studied him a long moment, searching for some trace of the fear he had expected and finding, instead, only a quiet, settled resolve that reminded him, unexpectedly, of soldiers he had once commanded decades earlier, men and women who had learned, through hard necessity, to meet danger with clear eyes rather than useless denial. It was not a comfort, exactly, to see that same quality in a 9-year-old boy. But it was, he had to admit, considerably better than the alternative. "I intend to make certain you are as prepared as any child could reasonably be," Hiruzen said, "but I want you to understand something else as well, Naruto. Being ready does not mean facing this alone. Whatever the Fletcher intends, he will find an entire village standing between him and you, not merely one small boy with a bow made of moonlight, however remarkable that bow may be." "I know," Naruto said, and for the first time since the conversation had begun, something like his old, familiar grin broke through the seriousness of his expression. "Guess that's the difference between now and 2 years ago, huh? Back then it really would have just been me. Now I've got you, and Irika-sensei, and Kiba, and Shikamaru, and Tsukiko, and this grumpy old fox who won't admit he actually likes me." He paused, considering. "That's a lot of people to let down if I mess this up. Guess I'd better not mess it up." Hiruzen found himself, despite the gravity of everything they had just discussed, unable to entirely suppress a small, genuine smile at that. Chapter 32. Renson made his choice 3 days later, in the quiet hours before dawn, standing in his warehouse office with the 2 letters he had drafted weeks earlier still sitting unsent in the same locked drawer. He had spent the intervening days turning Isamu's warning over and over, alongside a mounting, uncomfortable stream of rumor reaching even his own careful network. Occults merchants detained in Konoha, questioned, and found to be carrying ritual implements no ordinary trader would ever think to smuggle. It confirmed, in the worst possible way, everything Isamu had suspected and everything Renson himself had spent weeks trying not to fully believe. He was not dealing with an eccentric collector. He had been, for months now, an unwitting supplier to a cult old enough and patient enough to risk direct confrontation with a hidden village over a single child, and the weight of that realization had finally grown too heavy for even a man of his considerable practiced detachment to carry in silence any longer. He burned the evasive letter he had drafted for the buyer, and kept the other, the private accounting of everything he knew, folding it carefully into a sealed pouch alongside every scrap of correspondence he had exchanged with the man who called himself the Fletcher across the preceding months. "You're actually doing it," Isamu said, arriving at the warehouse as arranged, watching Renson seal the pouch with an expression somewhere between disbelief and grim approval. "Walking straight into a hidden village and handing over evidence against the cult with that kind of reach. That's not exactly the safest retirement plan I've ever heard." "Staying quiet isn't safe either," Renson said, and there was an honesty in it that surprised even himself. 2 decades of careful self-interest finally giving way to something he had not expected to find still alive in himself. "If that cult gets what it wants because I decided my own skin mattered more than a child's, I don't think I'd manage to live with that particular kind of safety for very long anyway." They traveled together, cautious and indirect, taking 3 days longer than the direct road would have required in order to avoid any watchers who might still be monitoring Renson's usual movements, and arrived at Konoha's gate on a gray, overcast morning, requesting, with a formality that clearly unsettled the gate guards processing the request, an urgent audience with the Hokage regarding a threat to the village's security. Hiruzen received them within the hour, Anbu stationed discreetly but unmistakably around the room, and listened, in careful and increasingly grim silence, as Renson laid out everything he knew, the Fletcher's correspondence, the cult's centuries-old grievance, the growing impatience that had finally driven the organization to risk direct action rather than continued patient observation. "I won't pretend I did this out of pure conscience," Renson said, when the accounting was finished, meeting the old Hokage's steady gaze without flinching. "I did plenty wrong before I understood what I was truly dealing with, and I won't ask you to forget that. But I'm done being a tool for whatever the Fletcher intends for that boy, and I'd rather spend whatever's left of my usefulness helping you stop him than spend it wondering what became of a child I helped put in danger. Hiruzen studied him a long while in silence, weighing the man's evident sincerity against the very real damage his earlier choices had already done, and found, in the end, that pragmatism and cautious mercy both pointed toward the same conclusion. Your information, he said finally, is worth a great deal more to this village than your punishment would be, Renson. I will not pretend your hands are entirely clean. But I am willing, for now, to let you prove exactly how far you intend to go in setting that right. Chapter 33. Renson's correspondence, laid out in full across Hiruzen's desk, gave the village its first genuine understanding of the Fletchers' intentions, and the picture it painted was considerably more urgent than anyone had allowed themselves to fully consider until now. The ritual the cult intended, according to fragments scattered across months of careful, coded exchange, required not merely the boy's capture but a specific alignment, a night of the full moon, when the huntress's power ran closest to the surface of the mortal world, and a location tied directly to her worship, where the old, sacred boundary between goddess and grove still held some measure of genuine power. The grove itself, the very clearing where Naruto had first been chosen, was, in the Fletcher's calculation, the only site within a reasonable distance that met both requirements, and the next full moon, Hiruzen's own astronomers confirmed within the hour, fell only 11 days away. He means to strike at the grove itself, Hiruzen said grimly, once the calculation had been laid bare before his assembled advisors. Not in the village, where our defenses run deepest, but on ground he believes still favors his cause, however mistaken that belief may prove to be. 11 days, gentlemen. That is all the time we have to prepare. The following days passed in a blur of careful, coordinated preparation unlike anything Naruto had experienced in his short life. ANBU teams mapped the grove's terrain with meticulous care, identifying every approach and every point of ambush a patient enemy might exploit. Iruka drilled him relentlessly on techniques meant to buy time and create distance rather than win outright confrontation, a shift in emphasis Naruto understood without needing it explained. Even Kurama, usually so measured in his counsel, grew sharper and more insistent in the days that followed, pushing Naruto through drills late into the night with an urgency that left no room for doubt about how seriously the fox regarded what was coming. You are not being asked to defeat this man alone, Kurama told him, on one particularly grueling evening when exhaustion had finally begun to fray Naruto's usual patience. You are being asked to survive long enough for the village's full strength to reach you, and to trust the people around you to do their part exactly as you are doing yours. That is not weakness, brat. That is precisely how any hunter with sense survives an enemy too large to face entirely alone. ***. Naruto absorbed the lesson slowly, over days rather than hours, the particular difficulty of learning to trust in a team after years of learning to survive entirely on his own instincts. But he found, watching the quiet, focused determination of the ANBU mapping the grove's every shadow, the steady patience in Iruka's eyes each evening as he corrected a stance or sharpened a technique, that the trust came more easily than he had expected it to. He was not, he reminded himself often in those final days, the same boy who had once stood alone in a rain-soaked clearing with nothing but a desperate wish to be seen. He had a village behind him now, imperfect and still learning how to fully deserve him, but present all the same, in ways it had never once been present for him before. On the 9th night, with the full moon only 2 days distant, he sat once more on his rooftop, Bao resting quiet in his lap, and spoke aloud to the sky the way he had on so many other nights before. I'm not scared of him, he said, and found, to his own quiet surprise, that it was mostly true. I'm scared of what happens if I let everybody down. But I'm not scared of the Fletcher. Whatever he thinks he's owed, he's not taking it from me. Not without a fight he's gonna remember for a long time. Above him, the moon rode close to full, patient and silver, and somewhere within its light, though he could not be certain, he thought he felt something that might have been approval settle briefly, warm and steady, across his shoulders. Tsukiko rose and pressed her head against his chest, and he wrapped both arms around her without embarrassment, the way he might not have allowed himself to a year earlier, when the habit of hiding every soft feeling behind bravado had still felt safer than simply letting himself be comforted. 2 years of small, patient kindnesses had worn that old habit down further than he had fully realized until moments exactly like this one, sitting under a nearly full moon with a war a mere 2 days distant, and finding that what steadied him most was not the bow in his lap or the fox behind his ribs, but the simple, solid warmth of a creature who had never once, in all their time together, needed him to be anything other than exactly what he was. Sleep, if you can manage it, Kurama said eventually, gentler than his usual gruff counsel. Whatever tomorrow and the day after bring, you will face them better rested than exhausted. I will keep watch, as I always have. Some things a fox does not need to be asked to do twice. Chapter 34. The night of the full moon arrived cold and clear, the sky scoured clean of cloud as though even the weather understood the significance of what was coming, and Naruto stood at the edge of the sacred grove flanked by more allies than he had ever imagined standing beside him when he had first found this place 2 years earlier, alone and soaked through and desperate simply to be seen. Hiruzen had insisted on being present himself, against the careful objections of his own advisors, arguing that a Hokage who asked a child to face this kind of danger owed that child, at minimum, the courage to stand near enough to share in the risk. Iruka stood close at Naruto's other side, jaw set with a determination that had nothing to do with rank or duty and everything to do with 2 years of quiet, careful care he had never once regretted giving. The NBU teams held positions throughout the surrounding tree line, unseen but ready, and Renson himself, in a gesture that surprised nearly everyone including Renson, had asked to be present as well, offering what he could of his knowledge of the Fletcher's methods in whatever small way might yet prove useful. You do not have to be the one who strikes the first blow, Hiruzen reminded Naruto quietly, as the moon climbed higher above the clearing's ancient stone. You have an entire village standing with you tonight. Let us carry as much of this weight as we are able. I know, Naruto said, and found, standing there with Sakiko solid and warm against his leg and Kurama's steady presence settled behind his ribs, that he genuinely did know it, all the way through, in a way that would have felt impossible to believe 2 years earlier. But he's coming for me specifically. I'm not gonna hide behind everybody else and hope it works out. I just wanted you all here so I knew, whatever happens, I wasn't facing it completely alone. The Fletcher arrived not long after moonrise, and his arrival carried none of the caution the merchants, or even Isamu had shown in their earlier approaches. He came directly through the trees at the clearing's edge, tall and massed in pale, ancient ivory carved into the shape of a stylized hawk, flanked by a dozen followers whose ordinary robes did little to disguise the disciplined, dangerous readiness in how they moved. Uzumaki, the Fletcher said, voice muffled but carrying easily across the clearing, holding a strange, formal courtesy that made the threat beneath it somehow more unsettling rather than less. 2 years I have watched you grow into precisely what the old texts promised, a vessel capable, at last, of restoring what was stolen from my order many centuries ago. I had hoped to take you quietly, without the theater of confrontation. Your Hokage's diligence has made that impossible. So be it. I did not travel this far, after waiting this long, to leave empty-handed regardless of the obstacles now standing between us. You're not taking anything from me, Naruto said, stepping forward despite Iruka's instinctive, protective hand rising toward his shoulder, bow already forming pale and solid between his palms. I don't know what you think I owe your order, but whatever happened to your hunter 1,000 years ago, it's got nothing to do with me. It has everything to do with you, the Fletcher said, and for the first time, something raw and unguarded slipped through the careful formality of his voice, old grief worn smoothed into obsession across too many patient generations. You carry her mark. Through you, what was taken can finally be restored. Whether you understand the debt or not changes nothing about what is owed. Renson, standing near the tree line among the assembled ANBU rather than beside the Fletcher's followers where fate might once have placed him, felt the full weight of that exchange settle uncomfortably into his chest, a stark reminder of exactly how close he had once come to being the hand that delivered this small, defiant boy into a stranger's grasping certainty. He said nothing, offered nothing, only watched with an expression that carried, for anyone paying close enough attention, the particular grim clarity of a man finally understanding the true size of what he had so nearly helped bring about. The clearing fell silent for one suspended, terrible heartbeat, moonlight pooling cold and bright across ancient stone, and then, without further warning, the Fletcher's followers surged forward as one, and the long-anticipated battle for the sacred grove finally began in earnest. Chapter 35. The ANBU met the Fletcher's followers before they had crossed half the clearing, breaking from the tree line in disciplined, coordinated pairs, and for several long, chaotic minutes the fight belonged entirely to trained shinobi rather than to the boy they had all come to protect. Naruto held his position exactly as instructed, bow drawn but patient, watching the battle's shifting currents with the same careful attention Tsukiko had spent 2 years teaching him to bring to any hunt, waiting for the moment his own particular skills would matter rather than simply adding chaos to a fight better handled by more experienced hands. That moment arrived when the Fletcher himself moved. He came not for Hiruzen, nor for the ANBU holding the clearing's center, but directly for Naruto, cutting through the fighting with a controlled, economical speed that spoke of centuries of practice ritual rather than ordinary shinobi training, ivory mask catching moonlight as he closed the distance with terrible purpose. Iruka moved to intercept, and was thrown aside with a force that spoke of power beyond simple taijutsu, a strange, cold pulse of energy that left him winded but to Naruto's flooding relief, breathing and conscious on the clearing floor. Enough delay, the Fletcher said, closing the final distance, one gloved hand reaching toward the mark on Naruto's wrist with the terrible, patient certainty of a man who believed himself entitled to what he was taking. Naruto did not run. He had promised himself, weeks earlier under a rooftop moon, that whatever came would find him ready rather than merely willing, and he drew on that promise now, releasing an arrow at point-blank range that should, by any ordinary measure, have ended the confrontation immediately. The Fletcher twisted aside with impossible speed, the arrow grazing his shoulder rather than striking true, and struck back with a blow that sent Naruto skidding hard across the clearing floor, breath driven from his lungs, bows scattering into threads of dissolving light. "Get up," Kurama urged, low and fierce. "He is fast, but he is not patient the way you have learned to be patient. Let him overextend. Do not meet his strength with your own. Use what she taught you. Naruto forced himself upright, tasting blood, and did exactly that, drawing on 2 years of Tsukiko's relentless drilling in stillness and misdirection rather than raw confrontation. He let the Fletcher's next strike sail past him by the barest margin, feeling the cold displacement of air where a blow meant to end the fight had instead found nothing, and in the single unbalanced heartbeat that followed, loosed the second arrow, not at the Fletcher's mask or chest, but at the ground beneath his advancing foot, shattering stone and sending him stumbling exactly the half-step off balance that a trained hunter needed. Tsukiko struck in that same instant, no longer small, no longer a pup, but a creature of full moonlit ferocity, driving the Fletcher back several critical paces with teeth and fury born of 2 years spent guarding this one boy above everything else in her ancient, wordless world. And in the space that opened, brief and precious, a shape older and larger than either of them folded itself once more around the clearing, the pale, antlered form of the goddess's own regard manifesting fully for the first time since the poacher's clearing 2 years earlier, standing between her chosen and the man who had spent his entire cursed inheritance trying to steal what she had freely given. "Enough," Artemis said, and her voice carried through the clearing like the horn call from the very first night, ancient and absolute. You have hunted my chosen for the crime of a debt he never owed you, Fletcher. Your predecessor challenged me out of arrogance and paid arrogance's honest price. You have spent 1,000 years mistaking justice for theft. I will not allow you to compound that mistake by taking what was never yours to claim. The Fletcher staggered back from the sheer weight of her presence, ivory mask cracking faintly at one edge, and for the first time since his arrival, something like genuine uncertainty crept into his ancient, patient voice. Around the clearing's edges, the fighting had stuttered to a ragged halt, ANBU and cult followers alike drawn up short by the sight of a goddess made briefly, undeniably manifest above the sacred stone, moonlight pooling thick and silver around her antlered shape until the whole clearing seemed to hold its breath at once. Naruto, still catching his own breath on the cold ground where the Fletcher's blow had sent him sprawling, watched with something between awe and exhausted relief as the woman from his very first memory of this place, tall and fierce and unmistakably real, stood once more between him and a danger too large for him to have faced entirely alone. This is the debt she spoke of once, long ago, before your order twisted it into something else, Kurama murmured quietly, almost gently, in the hush that had fallen. Listen carefully, Fletcher. She rarely offers a reckoning as honest as the one she is offering you now. Chapter 36. You would defend him, the Fletcher said, voice cracking beneath the mask, the way you refused to defend the one who came before him? He challenged you honestly, goddess. He asked only to be measured against your skill, and you answered his pride with death. He answered a contest with treachery long before I answered his arrogance with anything at all, Artemis said, and something ancient and unyielding settled into her voice, the weight of a story worn thin and distorted across 1,000 years of grief-fed retelling. Your order has spent centuries building a martyr out of a man who broke the terms of his own challenge the moment he believed he was losing it. I grieved him once, Fletcher, more than your order has ever cared to remember. I do not grieve what you have become in his name, *. The clearing held its breath, ANBU and cult followers alike pausing in their scattered struggles at the sheer weight of the goddess's presence, and the Fletcher, for the first time in a life built entirely around a single inherited grievance, seemed genuinely, visibly uncertain of the ground beneath him. Then what would you have me do? He said, quieter now, some of the ritual formality finally stripped away to reveal something more raw and more human beneath it, after 1,000 years of believing my order's whole purpose was justice denied. Grieve honestly, if you must grieve at all, Artemis said, gentler now, though no less absolute. But release the boy from a debt he never incurred. He has done nothing but survive a village that failed him for years, and become, despite that failure, precisely the kind of protector I have always valued most. Punishing him will not return what your order lost. It will only ensure you lose considerably more than pride tonight. The Fletcher stood a long moment in the moonlight, ivory mask cracked and unmoving, and then, slowly, deliberately, lowered the hand he had raised toward Naruto's wrist, and signaled, with a single sharp gesture, for his remaining followers to withdraw. It was not surrender, exactly, not the clean, satisfying end Naruto might once have imagined for a confrontation built up across so many tense and frightening days. It was something more complicated, an old, wounded certainty cracked but not fully broken, a retreat rather than a resolution, carrying within it the unspoken promise that the Fletcher's grief, however reframed by tonight's revelation, had not yet finished shaping whatever he chose to do next. He vanished into the tree line with the last of his followers, and did not look back. Naruto sat heavily on the clearing's cold ground once the danger had truly passed, Tsukiko pressing warm and solid against his side, Iruka limping over to check on him with a mixture of relief and lingering alarm that made Naruto, despite everything, manage a tired, genuine laugh. Hiruzen crossed the clearing more slowly, old joints protesting the night's tension, and settled beside him with the particular weary satisfaction of a man who had feared, more than he had let himself admit even to his closest advisers, that this night might end very differently. You did well, Hiruzen said simply, resting a hand briefly on Naruto's shoulder. Better than well. You held your ground, trusted the people around you, and let mercy temper victory rather than demanding blood for it. That is not a lesson every grown shinobi manages to learn in an entire lifetime. Naruto looked up at the moon, riding full and silver directly overhead, and felt, beneath the exhaustion and the ache of a hard-fought night, something steady and lasting settle into place inside him. The Fletcher was gone, not defeated so much as unmade in some quiet, personal way that might yet prove more dangerous or might, just as easily, prove the beginning of something better. Renson stood at the clearing's edge, watching with an expression that suggested his own long reckoning was far from finished. And above them all, unseen but unmistakably present, a goddess who had chosen a lonely, overlooked boy 2 years earlier watched her champion rise, battered and victorious, into whatever came next. Rest now, Artemis said, one final time, quiet as moonlight settling over water. You have more than earned it. And when you are ready, Naruto Uzumaki, There is still a great deal further left for you to become. They walked back to the village together as the eastern sky began, faintly, to pale toward morning. A strange and battered procession of Hokage and academy instructor and reformed broker and one exhausted, victorious boy with a wolf trotting steady at his heel. Word of the night's events would spread through the village in the days that followed, carefully managed by Hiruzen to protect what needed protecting while still acknowledging, at last and without further concealment, that something remarkable had grown up quietly among them these past 2 years. Naruto did not yet know how that reckoning would unfold, whether the village that had once crossed the street to avoid him would learn to see him fully now, or simply trade one kind of careful distance for another shaped by awe instead of fear. He found, walking home in the pale light of a hard-won dawn, that he was too tired and too full of quiet, hard-earned peace to worry over it that particular morning. There would be more to face in the days ahead. He understood that much clearly even through his exhaustion. The Fletcher had retreated, not been destroyed, and history rarely allowed old grievances to end quite so cleanly as one difficult night in a moonlit clearing. Danzo's patient ambitions had not vanished simply because tonight's crisis had passed. But for this one morning, with Tsukiko warm against his side and Irika's steady hand resting on his shoulder and Hiruzen walking beside him in companionable, hard-won silence, Naruto Uzumaki allowed himself, fully and without reservation, to simply feel glad to be alive, and gladder still that he no longer had to feel that way alone. Thanks for listening.